in the luxurious office of the director of the restaurant. In the place where the subordinates were usually located sat a man in his 50s. Since there was a tense silence in the room, one could assume that the upcoming conversation was quite serious. Little did he know that Philip Miller was anxiously awaiting the decision of his boss, James Harrison. Working as the manager of this fine establishment, he found himself in a situation where he urgently needed someone's help. When on earth is he walking around? I've been sitting in this office for the past hour like a lost man, probably admiring his restaurant again, Philip thought with irritation. At the same moment, the door opened and James Harrison entered the room. He was a tall, trim man with a kind but overly pale face and a strong-willed chin. His shrewd gaze slid over Philip's face, unmistakably recognizing the uneasiness that plagued his employee's soul. "Shall we get to the heart of the matter, Philip? What is the reason for your desire to meet?" James Harrison said, sitting down in a leather armchair. "I hope your daughter Emily is all right." "Yes, of course she's fine," he answered hastily, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. It was hard to get to the point, though it should be easier for him since he was the manager of the restaurant. "That's good to hear," James Harrison said. "I've always sympathized with Emily. She's a lovely, sweet girl." Philip swallowed convulsively at this compliment to his daughter and looked at his boss with a hunted look. At the same moment, he realized the inevitable. James Harrison was his only chance to get out of debt, and that was to marry his daughter off to this rich man. But how do you get the boss to make that decision? To make it go smoothly? The tension in the room became so palpable that it felt like skates could be molded into the air. Philip visibly tensed, struggling to find the words that could convince his boss to agree to his proposal. "I realize this may sound sudden, but I'm in a very difficult situation," he began, his voice trembling with excitement. "What kind of trouble are you in, Philip? Am I not paying you enough? It seems to me that your salary is more than serious," the businessman said in surprise. Philip coughed embarrassedly. "Well, you see, I've got debts that I just can't pay off on my own." James Harrison frowned. A serious expression appeared on his face. He squinted at the manager, waiting for further explanation. The next words came with great difficulty to Philip. "You see, James, you probably know I've been looking for a suitor for my daughter for a long time. And Emily is sure to make a fine wife to whoever chooses her." James Harrison looked at his subordinate with bewilderment. "I do not understand what you're getting at, Philip. Do you need money for the wedding?" Then asked directly, "Why these curtsies?" But Philip was silent. His mind raced in search of a reasonable explanation. At last, catching on to one of the words he thought promising, he came to the main point. "James, the fact is, I would like to marry my daughter Emily to you." Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hand involuntarily reached around his neck to loosen the knot of his tie. In truth, he'd never thought of Emily romantically, seeing her solely as the daughter of his manager, and here he was being offered to marry a girl about to become his stepdaughter. "Philip, I appreciate your confidence, but I don't think it's the best idea," he said cautiously. "Emily is a wonderful girl, but I don't think she's ever considered me for a fiancé." Philip's eyes twinkled with a sly twinkle. "James, it's the only way out for me. Emily won't mind, and Jessica doesn't think so either. And I'll be eternally grateful to you if you do." "Does Jessica really think so too? Why didn't she ever tell me that?" James Harrison exclaimed, and then his lips pressed into a thin line. Of course, the businessman understood the situation in which his subordinate found himself, along with his wife, who worked in the same restaurant as a cook's assistant. Truth be told, the thought of a marriage of convenience brought James no pleasure. "Easy. James Harrison, this is a touchy subject. I can't make a decision right away," he said. "I need time to think it over, to calculate all the risks." Philip looked pleadingly at his boss and tried to grasp every opportunity. "Please, James Harrison, give me a chance to make things right. My daughter Emily doesn't deserve the kind of life I've given her." James Harrison shook his head. The businessman then rose from his chair and walked to the window that offered a panoramic view of the city. On his haggard, pale face, there was an expression of deep thoughtfulness. He was trying to make a difficult decision. "Well, Philip, I promised to think it over carefully, and I'll let you know my decision as soon as possible," he said, turning to the manager. Philip respectfully extended his hand to the restaurant owner. "Thank you for your understanding. I look forward to hearing from you," he said with relief. James Harrison nodded and shook the manager's hand firmly. Philip left the office with a heavy heart. The fate of his adopted daughter Emily and his own future now depended on the decision of the superintendent. Deep down, Philip felt that the boss would take the bait. After all, Rose was right. She had calculated everything subtly, immediately realized how to catch this rich man. They've been together for a year for a reason. Wife Jessica's a sucker. All her romantic dreams of love are ridiculous. No fool is a fool. Philip left his boss's office and immediately called Rose. "Hi, it's me. Did you talk to him and tell him what you told me?" "Of course I did, Philip. He was drooling at the thought of my Emily. Men are like that. But here's the thing about the hat instead of the dowry. Let James pay off our debts, and then we'll be on our way." Rose smiled. They talked for a while. Then they went about their business. Philip took control of the restaurant, and Rose watched another TV show. At the same time, Philip's wife Jessica was helping the chef Michael Thompson in the kitchen as if nothing had happened. It was rumored that he was friends with the owner himself and often visited him. "James has been a little down lately," the chef said casually. Jessica dropped her knife in surprise. "What do you mean, down?" "I think he's fine, but he's a little thin, of course. A little blush would be nice." "Why is it so bad?" Jessica asked anxiously. Vance to Thompson's side, sad. "It's bad, Jessica, and it's bad. They found a disease, but one that would break your tongue to pronounce. The prognosis is dire. They say James is ready to write his will." "Way, will?" Jessica was surprised. "But as far as I know, he's alone. No relatives." That chef chuckled. "That's what I'm talking about. James called a notary recently to prepare the necessary documents. He says I'll make a will in favor of the woman who agrees to marry me. What's he thinking? He's got half the town after him now. It's not right." "What about love? Feelings?" Jessica marveled. Michael Thompson frowned, tasting the dish he had prepared. "Well, when you've got 6 months to live, it's not that big of a deal. James wants to die in the arms of some pretty girl. Well, I'm exaggerating, of course, but that's the gist of it. Who else would he leave his money to?" Jessica coughed, embarrassed. "Orphanages, for example, or social funds." Michael Thompson waved his hand. "No way, they'll steal it. You need to keep an eye on the money." "And who's going to do it?" "That's right. And so you see, and will still fall in love. Although, of course, the case is complicated. It's not easy to understand the true motives, but I'm not interested in any of that. I've known him since high school. We played hockey. I was a forward. He was a forward. Oh, how long ago was that?" Jessica nodded sympathetically, not even realizing that at that very moment her husband Philip was discussing the marriage of Emily and James Harrison. Time stretched like rubber, showing Philip eternity. Every phone call, every sound of footsteps behind him made his heart beat with furious force. To his only wife, Jessica, he said nothing. Only to his mistress, who had actually devised this cunning plan. Finally, close to lunchtime, the phone rang in his jacket pocket. Philip took the call with a trembling hand, realizing that it could fundamentally change his life. The caller was James Harrison, who again invited him to his office. Philip now went to his boss on his feet, trying not to notice the nasty shiver that ran down his back. This time, the chief met his subordinate with a serious, but at the same time not without sympathy look. "Philip, I've made a decision," he said with a dry official tone. I agree to take Jessica and your daughter, Emily. In doing so, I agree to pay off all your debts to creditors." Philip was so stunned that he couldn't even hold back the tears of relief, which of course were fake publicity. At the same moment, he hugged the businessman, replying with equally warm feelings. "Thank you, James Harrison. Thank you for saving me and my daughter from disgrace. And thank you for giving me a chance," the manager whispered, resting his face against his shoulder. The business boss felt the responsibility he had taken on and promised he would never regret the decision. "I will take care of Emily as if she were my own daughter. You can rest assured of that." Philip nodded demurely and began to discuss the details with the chief. In a confidential conversation, they set the day of the wedding, which was to take place in a week's time. James Harrison, horrified at the sight, was not in the least embarrassed by this haste. Philip, on the other hand, was over the moon. After all, he would not only get rid of debts, but also provide his adopted daughter a bright future. True, first of all, he thought, of course, about his own benefit, and everything else was a matter of tenth. And if Jessica and Emily knew what lay ahead of them, the first to know was the wife. It was in the evening when Jessica returned from work later than her husband, who, as the manager, was in fact her boss. By this time, the atmosphere in the house was already tense, which at any moment could erupt in anger and resentment. Jessica stood in the living room with her purse on the floor, her hands shaking and her eyes burning with tears. Opposite her, her husband was seated comfortably in an armchair by the blazing fireplace. The cold, calculating expression on Philip's face contrasted perfectly with the shock in his wife's eyes. "How could you?" Jessica blurted out from the doorway. At the same moment, her voice broke into a scream. "How could you sell our daughter for debt? Have you nothing sacred left?" Wide smiles. "You know, it's not really a sale, more like a lucrative contract, if you will. I'm just securing our family's future and nothing more. James Harrison is a wealthy man, and being related to him will save us from financial problems in the future. And not just us, but Emily herself, and even her children." "Have you thought about the shame?" Jessica spluttered. "You're giving our daughter away to a man twice her age. What will people think of us? How am I supposed to face the restaurant staff if I become the mother-in-law of the owner?" "James Harrison is a respected man in the community," Philip said reasonably, "and he looks quite lively for his age. How much do you understand? Feelings are not bought with money. Certainly not love," Jessica retorted. "And how could you set our daughter up like that? She's a young, beautiful girl. Yes, she deserves much more than to be a pawn in your financial scams." After his wife's words, Philip instinctively looked around, although he knew perfectly well that Emily was still at work. A nurse in therapy sounds proud. 24 hours a day at work and not much profit. But now that she was gone, Philip decided to continue the awkward conversation. "This isn't about toys, Jessica," he exclaimed angrily. "This is a matter of life and death. And first and foremost for you, dearie, we're on the verge of ruin. And James Harrison is our only chance to save ourselves. And if this wedding falls through, you won't have a job at the restaurant. Worst case scenario, you'll be selling pies at the bus stop." Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes. "Do you think it's okay that our salvation should depend on our daughter's marital status? Does Emily deserve to be married like that?" "Didn't she?" Philip objected. "She deserves the opportunity to secure a secure future for herself and her future children. And what do you suggest? Bend over backwards for the rest of her life in this department. With James Harrison, she'll be living like Christ, holding a fortune in her hands," Philip said confidently. "No, what are you talking about? Our daughter deserves to be loved." "Philip, but why should she have his money when James Harrison is seriously ill?" Jessica insisted. "She doesn't need wealth. She needs real feelings." Sick. That's a good one. "I didn't know that," Philip said in surprise. "Then she'll be an heiress sooner, won't she?" "She'll be rewarded with your love," Jessica said bitterly. "Nonsense. a fiction, a luxury we can't afford now. But money is something else, Philip replied without blinking an eye. And you want to solve your problems at the expense of your daughter? Maybe you better start moving yourself. Jessica exclaimed, choking back tears. Peace ends. Of course. How could I not? Especially since she's not my own daughter, and neither are you. So there's no need to appeal to my fatherly feelings. But James said it's her destiny, period. You and I owe it to her to make her happy, Philip said in one breath. Jessica covered her face with her hands and sobbed. Destiny? What do you know about it? We're going to ruin her life, you know, and Emily is my own daughter. So what if I took her from an orphanage? It's not the mother who gave birth. It's the mother who raised her. Philip's cheeks are flushed with anger. My mother is an orphanage, the daughter of an alcoholic. Are you out of your mind? Yes, I agreed to the custody arrangement and took care of her all this time. I'm still taking care of her now. You hear me? And if you get it in the way, I will tell Emily the truth. You don't want that, do you? So calm down, Jessica. Think about your family and use your judgment. It's just the way it is. You don't want to stand up on the street, do you? Jessica slumped her shoulders, shaken by her sobs, her heart breaking with worry for her daughter's future. She knew Philip was right, and though their family was on the brink of ruin, James Harrison couldn't be their only hope, not at this price. No, not at the cost of their only daughter's fate. No, I can't do it, Philip, she whispered. I can't sell my daughter. I'd rather be on the street, but not this. Philip smiled smugly, then took the poker and began to stir the embers in the fireplace, making sparks fly in all directions. You've already done it, he said, calming down a little. Yes, Jessica, you've already sold your daughter. From the moment James and I signed the prenup papers. Jessica looked up at her husband in surprise. Her eyes were full of pain and despair. What prenup? What are you talking about? We can still back out. We could apologize to James Harrison. He'll understand, won't he? With a sneer. Philip interjected. Yes, he'd destroy us if he knew we'd changed our minds. He already treats us with contempt, treats us like servants. Fetch, serve, and get out of his sight. Don't think he'll forgive us for this. Jessica recoiled from her husband. At that moment, her heart almost burst with pain. Truth be told, she still couldn't believe that Philip was so easily willing to sacrifice his daughter's happiness for his own gain. You monster, Jessica shouted. Do you hear me? I hate you. Philip gave her a scornful look, but did not reply. He simply got up from his chair and walked out of the living room. Jessica still stood there, unable to take a step, her whole body trembling. She knew that her husband would never change his mind. That meant Emily was doomed. While Jessica and Philip were discussing their relationship, James Harrison was sitting in his office watching the fish swimming in the aquarium. The businessman was not feeling well. Painkillers practically did not help, so he felt a strong decline in strength. In his head were born thoughts of how to burn a profitable alliance with Emily. God, marrying Philip's daughter. What if it didn't work out? But he was on the verge of bankruptcy. It would be an ingenious move on Philip's part to get him out of financial trouble. James cringed at the thought of it. At 49, he already felt like a real old man. And then there was this disease. It had aged him in a matter of months. Did he need this wedding? A difficult question, and one he didn't know the answer to. He also doubted Emily's motives. Would she truly love him, or would she be just an obedient tool in her father's hands? The thought of a marriage based on mutual gain was unpleasant to him. In truth, he wanted true love, the union of two hearts. Besides, a marriage with Emily could ruin his reputation, because people will surely whisper that he is a cold-blooded, calculating rich man, ready to do anything to satisfy his own ego. Emily is beautiful, of course, but is she intelligent, kind, sensual? They've barely spoken to each other. What if she doesn't like me? Looking at his own reflection in the mirror, James whispered. The businessman's doubts increased when he realized he was overestimating the importance of the union. After all, most marriages of convenience last for years. What's easier for everyone? One pays, the other bathes in luxury. You mean, nothing complicated. The usual scheme of human exchange based on the sale of feelings. It's all right. But James wanted to feel truly loved, desired, not just a tool in someone else's hands. Not an easy decision, but you have to weigh it carefully. And he had to be honest with himself, with Philip and Jessica. But maybe there's another way that doesn't require sacrifice. Maybe I could find a way to help Philip without marrying his daughter, James asked himself again, wiping the mirror with the palm of his hand. Little did he know that this was what he had been doing for the past few years, without any close friends. James Harrison was talking to himself, as if he were talking to his twin brother on the other side of the mirror. Sighing sadly, the businessman stood up and walked to the window. The city, too, had been swallowed up by twilight. The lights of lanterns and signs pierced the darkness like the identifying lights of ships heading toward a strong beacon. For a moment, James felt so alone that he wanted to howl with longing, and yet there were so many people hanging around. But James needed someone who could understand and share the last days of his life with him. Maybe even give him a glass of water or gently cover his eyelids when he was gone. Or maybe even weep at his grave and bring him a bouquet on his anniversary. Dreams. James knew that Philip's daughter was beautiful. But was that all that mattered? Would they be able to create something truly worthwhile together? Realizing that he couldn't make a final decision, James decided to talk to Emily in person. To do this, he was going to call her to his restaurant tomorrow to observe her manners and words. Perhaps it was then that the businessman would be able to understand whether they had a future together. And if not, well, we will have to accept that not all problems can be solved with the help of money, although he will still fulfill his obligations to Philip. After all, James considered himself a man of his word and was not going to break it, even in the face of his own death. How long did Dr. Thompson give him? A month? 3? Could he be lucky enough to last 6 months? Unsure of his theory, the businessman decided to call Emily the next morning, since he knew for a fact that tomorrow was her day off. Probably in this whole amazing story, Emily was the only one who didn't know until the last what was going on around her and what her parents and the businessman were up to. In the life of a young nurse, Emily also changed, and the kind that if her father found out about it, he would definitely go into hysterics, sputtering saliva and stomping his feet. It all began a little over a week ago. That morning, the rays of dawn were barely breaking through the blinds as Emily, a nurse on the therapy ward, prepared to turn in for her shift. But she was in for a bitter disappointment as the shift nurse, Felipe, had not shown up for work. Well, once again, the superintendent called her into the office. Emily thought bitterly. She, in turn, had spent a sleepless night tormented by doubts and fears. As it happened, not only was her place as a nurse on the ward at stake, but also the life of a man who was on death's doorstep. It all started with the fact that, late in the evening, a man without documents was brought to them with signs of severe pneumonia. He was brought by a city cab driver who could not pass by, because this vagrant collapsed on the hood of his car while crossing the street. At first, I thought he was just trying to get money from me, set me up. But when I touched his forehead, I knew. He's got a high fever, the driver said as he pulled the unconscious guy into the squad room. Emily nodded and helped pull him into the corridor. The tramp's condition was clearly critical, and without treatment, he had no chance of recovery. Thanking the cab driver, Emily, at her own risk, decided to give him first aid. As she did so, she saw in the stranger's eyes a strength of spirit and will to live that was felt on a subconscious level. Despite the disapproval of her colleagues and the threats of the doctor on duty, Emily made the bold decision to go against all odds. At her discretion, she introduced additional procedures and stayed with the patient throughout the night, providing not only medical but also psychological support. The night dragged on for an agonizingly long time. "What's your name?" After checking the patient's temperature, Emily asked. The boy shuddered and then slowly opened his eyes. "Victor. My name is Victor," he whispered. "That's good. Rest until morning. There's still time. We'll see," Emily whispered. Victor's condition improved a little and then worsened again. Emily did not leave his bedside for a minute, watching his every breath and movement. She believed that despite all predictions, the tramp would make it through the morning. Her perseverance and dedication began to bear fruit. By the time of the first shift, Victor's breathing had become more even, and his temperature began to gradually drop. But when ward manager Robert Stevenson came to check on his progress, he was surprised and shocked by what had happened. "Emily, who is this guy? And what right do you have to treat him as you see fit? Why did you give him a private room? Aren't you taking on too much?" he asked defiantly. Emily shuddered and began to explain what had happened. Even though the patient was doing well, she was still in danger of being fired. But she didn't regret her decision. She had saved a man who no one had given a chance, and that was more important to her than her own career. "I've seen a lot of things, but this, why on earth would you bring him to the station? Did you know we're having a ministry inspection at the clinic today? You should at least listen to the doctor on duty. Well, call a cab and get out of here with your tramp," Robert Stevenson stated unequivocally and pointed at the door. At that moment, Victor opened his eyes and understood everything without words. Staggering, he got up from the bed, got dressed, and disconnected the drip. "Good boy, you got it right," the superintendent muttered. Emily shook her head contritely. What could she do? But she couldn't take the patient home with her. Her father would make a scene, and she didn't want that. She could treat the vagrant remotely, though, giving him injections at another place she'd only recently learned of in her unenviable position. It was the only right thing to do, and so it had to be done that way and no other. Victor, on the other hand, took it calmly. He did not push pity, and also did not become hysterical or beg to leave him in the hospital. He dressed silently and, nodding goodbye, walked toward the exit. Emily looked at the superintendent with a mute reproach in her eyes and, without saying goodbye, followed, supporting Victor by the shoulder. Emily led him hurriedly to the cab. The tramp's pale cheeks seemed whiter than snow in the sunlight, and his gray eyes expressed almost nothing that they should have. "Where are we going?" he wheezed in a weak voice. "Someplace safe. Someplace where you'll be taken care of," Emily replied. Luckily, the cab stopped right by the side of the field. She carefully placed Philip in the back seat, then handed the driver a slip of paper with the address of an abandoned house on the outskirts of town that served as a shelter for the homeless. As the cab moved forward, the hustle and bustle of the city was replaced by abandoned industrial neighborhoods. The landscape of parks turned into weedy wastelands. Gleaming high-rises gave way to the dilapidated houses of the poorer neighborhoods. The cabbie drove in silence. He didn't want to start a conversation with the tramp, and this despite the fact that Philip behaved decently and looked almost nothing like a homeless man. Finally, the car stopped in front of a dilapidated two-story house. The brick facade of the building was cracked like an old man's face. The windows hadn't had glass in 10 years, if not more. A sign that read "House of Mercy" hung from the moldering wooden doors. Emily carefully opened the door and helped Philip out of the car. The cool spring air finally knocked the heat from his exhausted body. After paying the cab driver, Emily and Philip entered the dimly lit hallways that smelled of dampness and disinfectant solution. At the same time, a slouching figure in a white coat advanced toward them. Emily recognized her. It was Rose, a nurse who had been in the same group at medical school. They had chosen very different jobs. Emily became a nurse in the therapy department, and Rose became a nurse in a shelter for the homeless and destitute. Together they took Philip to a tiny room where they laid him on an old, creaking bed. A small window barely let in the dim light, highlighting the dusty ceilings and shabby walls. Philip's body began to shake again. Rose took out a thermometer and put it to the Trump's chest. The man's heart was racing as if he had just run a 100-meter race for time. He has severe pneumonia, Emily explained. Had dreaded glum. He needs antibiotics and oxygen. Rose nodded and fetched a small first aid kit and vials of medicine from the cabinet. With confident movements, she injected the antibiotic into Philip's vein and put the oxygen mask on his face. The trembling in the patient's body gradually subsided as the medicine began to flow through the IV into his body. Emily stood a little to the side and watched Rose care for the patient with mixed feelings of gratitude and sadness. She knew he wouldn't have lived a day without their help. "How did he end up on the street?" Rose asked. "It's hard to say," Emily sighed. "He doesn't say much. I met him a few hours ago. I wanted to leave him at the station, but they wouldn't let me." Rose nodded in agreement. She'd seen enough street people in her life to know that each of them had a complicated history. Philip, on the other hand, was just another poor wretch in a long line of people left behind by a ruthless society. "I'll take care of him," Rose said. "Until he feels better, he'll stay here." "Thank you, Rose. I won't forget your help." Emily said goodbye and went outside. Then she hailed a cab again and asked the driver to take her home. All the way home she thought of Philip, forgotten by everyone, but given a second chance at life. The next day Emily returned to Mercy House with hot soup, a plate and a spoon. She found Philip lying in bed with a tattered book in his hands. His breathing was hoarse, and his face was covered with a crimson blush. His eyes were sunken and his lips were pressed into a thin line. Emily gently fed Philip some soup and offered him a bath, to which he shook his head negatively. The nurse smiled and sat silently by his side, holding his hand. It went on like this for about a week. Emily visited Philip, and together they talked in hushed tones about everything. Of course, because of her work, Emily couldn't spend too much time at Mercy House. But despite this, she still tried to visit the patient almost every day. Naturally, she kept it all a secret from her parents, especially from her father, who lately had been thinking of marrying her off well. Her mother, on the other hand, did not rush her daughter with her choice, wanting to keep her by her side longer. Emily was also well aware of the fact that she was adopted and found out about it quite by accident, when, as a high school student, decided to do a general cleaning of the house. In the absence of her parents, everything came out of the blue when a folder of custody papers fell into her hands from the top shelf of her closet. I wondered, who were her real parents? Were they rich or poor? Did they have any other children? Or was she the first one they decided to get rid of? She didn't know the answer to these questions. However, in order not to upset her, her mother decided to hide the truth about those very documents from her. Let it be so. Why upset the person who loves you more than life itself? That's what Emily thought as she walked home from work one more time. She had no idea what her father had in store for her when he saw her daughter leave. Philip decided to come in from afar. First he asked how work was and if she was doing well. Then he got to the point by saying that his boss, James Harrison, wanted to see her tomorrow. Emily's amazement knew no bounds to see me. Why should he? I'm nothing to him. The daughter of a restaurant manager, but James Harrison probably knows better, Philip said with pressure and looked meaningfully at his wife. Jessica sighed sadly and turned away from the window. Her husband had deftly played on her pain point, making her fear that her daughter might learn the truth about her past. What could she do? Talk her out of it and not go? But that wouldn't do anything, would it? Philip had already taken money from James, and not only had he taken it, but he'd already given it to his creditors. Of course, Jessica was bitter about what was happening. Her only hope was that her daughter would resent it and not go through with the deal. But she would have to come to that decision on her own to understand, to feel the whole situation. If only Jessica could have known that at that very moment, Emily was only concerned about one thing: the health of Ben's little brother, who was slowly, perhaps, on the mend. The next morning, So as not to upset Daddy, Emily went to meet James Harrison at the restaurant. By this time, the office of the businessman and creditor was literally saturated with an atmosphere of anxious expectation. Huge windows overlooking the city that lived its life gave the illusion of boundless power and authority. Behind the massive walnut desk sat James Harrison himself. The businessman's shrewd gaze, hidden behind his fine-rimmed glasses, was like an X-ray scanning those who dared to cross the threshold of his office. Today James wore an austere, dark blue suit that accentuated his lean figure and commanded the respect of those who had acquired a patriarchal paunch by this age. Emily knocked on the door before stepping over the threshold and timidly asking, "May I, James Harrison?" The businessman nodded as if the guest were his companion, not the daughter of a subordinate, anticipating a difficult conversation. The girl's heart raced and her hands became moist, as if before the most important exam of her life. A plain dress and low-heeled shoes made her look modest, a person who knew the value of money. The bright blush on her cheeks was evidence of the nervous tension she was trying to hide under a mask of ostentatious calm. Emily's appearance caught James Harrison's attention. A slight smile lit up his lips as he leaned back in his chair, assessing his visitor. The appearance was flawless. Her delicate features, large expressive eyes, and light chestnut-colored hair could drive anyone crazy, except that James himself wasn't going to go crazy. Not at all. In fact, under the guise of a bride, he was buying himself a daughter for an indefinite period of time, whose beautiful face would be the last thing he would see on this sinful earth. Well, in the meantime, let everyone think I'm a lusty rich man who has decided to gratify his ego in the face of his imminent demise. "Have a seat, Emily," he said in a low, measured voice. His cold tone left no doubt that the conversation was. Emily sank awkwardly to the edge of the chair, her skinny hands clenched into fists under the table. Of course, she couldn't ignore the hardness of James Harrison's gaze, which seemed to penetrate the most secret corners of her soul. "I don't know what to say." She immediately gave the initiative to the master of the office. "I know your father's in dire straits," James Harrison began, crossing his fingers in a lock on the newly flat surface of the desk. "However, I'm sure I can help him with his debts. I hope Philip has warned you about that." The businessman's words had an icy shower effect on Emily. The surprise took her breath away, and tears came to her eyes. "But my daddy didn't tell me anything about the debts," she whispered in a voice shaking with despair. "Okay, I didn't really doubt that. Surely Philip must have dumped that part of the case on me." James Harrison stretched out disappointedly. "And after all, his personal business has gone bust and he won't be able to repay the loan without my help. But don't get me wrong. It's not like I'm a charitable organization. I have obligations too." Emily felt that the businessman was leading her to something important, something that would change her life completely and irrevocably. For better or for worse. "I'm sorry, I don't understand what this is about," Emily asked timidly. James Harrison sighed sadly, displaying a complete semblance of compassion. "Believe me, I'm really, really sorry, Emily. I understand this is a difficult time, and your father was doing the best he could. Except we're talking about a considerable amount of money," he said. "And even if I were to agree to be a guarantor to reimburse the creditors, I'm not sure your father would be able to handle the payments." "Please give my dad a chance," Emily pleaded, and her eyes immediately filled with tears. "I won't let you down. Would you like me to work for you for free on the weekends? Or write promissory notes in my name? Just save me." The young girl's tears involuntarily broke James Harrison's restraint, forcing him to relive some of the less pleasant moments in his life. And after all, he hadn't gotten to the most important part yet, but how to tell this innocent-eyed girl what he was really up to. Where to get the nerve not to burn with shame? Thinking about it, James looked away, unable to withstand the direct and emotional appeal. There was silence in the office for a while, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, James Harrison looked at Emily again. For the first time since their meeting, something resembling understanding flashed in the businessman's eyes. "All right, Emily," he said, pronouncing her name slowly, as if hearing it for the first time. "I'm willing to give your father a chance, but you must realize that if you don't fulfill your obligations to me, your father will be in serious trouble." Hope shone in Emily's eyes, and the tears and sadness on her face were replaced by a wide smile. "Thank you," she uttered with relief. "I won't let you down. Don't even doubt it. And what do I need to do for you to get your father's debt paid?" James Harrison turned pale, realizing that the moment of truth had arrived. Here he would gather air in his chest and say what Philip could not say. "Just don't drift," the man mentally told himself. Finally, realizing there was no turning back, he said in a choked voice, "You must be my wife, Emily." Emily flinched and pressed her back against the back of the chair. "A wife? But we have such an age difference. How is that even possible?" James got up from the table and started pacing around the room like a man on a roll. At this point, he was ready to fall through the ground in shame. Why had he said that? Why had he gone along with Philip? The businessman's condition suddenly worsened dramatically, causing him to nearly collapse from the extreme pain in his chest. "Are you feeling ill?" Emily shouted as she saw the businessman slumped on his side, clinging to the edge of the table with his fingers. No, it will pass surely. Now, just a little more. The pills are in my jacket pocket," James whispered, losing consciousness. Even though Emily was a nurse, this was hardly the first time she had encountered something like this. "I'm going to call an ambulance now," she exclaimed through tears. When Emily reached for the phone at the foot of the businessman's desk, she saw the man writhing on the floor with his hands around his throat. Oh my God, he had a laryngeal injury. She quickly dialed the ambulance number and whispered to the dispatcher, explained the situation in a nutshell. The dispatcher replied, "You see, there's been a serious accident downtown. A truck is skidded at speed and it has demolished several cars. We don't have any crews available right now." "Say, you're a medical professional, right?" "Right?" the female dispatcher asked. "Yes, I'm a medical technician. But what does that change? Aren't you going to send a resuscitation team to me?" "He's dying. Hear me, he's dying," Emily tearfully shouted into the phone. "Calm down, girl. My name is Sarah. I was a medical surgeon in the past. Tell me, would you be able to perform a tracheostomy on a patient under my supervision?" Emily nearly dropped the phone in amazement. "A tracheostomy? But I work in internal medicine, and I've never picked up a scalpel." "That's okay. Calm down and listen to me carefully. There's a first time for everything sometime. If you don't do this, the patient will die of asphyxiation. Do you understand?" Sarah exclaimed. Emily shifted her gaze to the injured James Harrison and realized that there was no other option anyway. What happened next she remembered like a blur. She called the waiter and ordered him to bring a clean towel, a knife, and something to sanitize. Her mother, Jessica, was in the kitchen at the time, helping the chef prepare another order. Emily acted almost mindlessly, as if on automatic. She made an incision with the knife near her throat, inserted the tube, and was relieved to hear the distinctive whistling sound. My God, the patient is breathing, really breathing, ran through her mind. For a while, James Harrison even opened his eyes as if he wanted to say something very important. Tears flowed from the businessman's eyes as he realized that Emily had just saved his life. It wasn't long before the emergency room doctors finally arrived. Emily sat in the corner and cried, crying because she had never been so heartbroken. When Jessica heard what had happened, she ran into the office and began to hug her daughter. I'm sorry, honey. I'm so stupid for listening to your father. You shouldn't have come here and you don't need any money. Let him work it out for himself." Emily looked at her mom in surprise. "You knew about this too, and you didn't say anything?" "At first I kept quiet, but then my dad started blackmailing me into saying that he'd tell me like I wasn't related to you." "Now, you knew?" Emily blurted out. Jessica covered her face with her hands and cried again. Meanwhile, the paramedic on the team began thanking the nurse for the surgery. "Yes, you surprised me, girl, very much. It had to be so skillfully conducted, step by step, and the incision is so neat. Want to show medical students in lectures. I think the surgeon on duty will be grateful to you. That I am A.T. It's Sarah, thanks, your dispatcher. She was the one who directed you." The paramedic was silent for a moment, and then politely said goodbye and followed his colleagues, carrying James Harrison to the ward of the local hospital. And at this very moment, her unworthy father was miles away, in a cozy bed with his mistress Rose. "So, did we spin this thing out pretty good?" The hottie asked. Alex looked at the girl with disbelief, but it's too early to say for sure. You know, James can change his mind 100 times. True, he has already transferred the money to pay off my imaginary debt. Well, I've got it all figured out. Now all I have to do is wait for him to include your daughter in his will, and it's done. Smiled. Alex visibly tensed. "Listen, how did you know that Adamson wanted to include in the will the girl who would agree to commit her life to him?" The pretty girl smiled coquettishly and stood up from the bed, adjusting her robe. "How did you know?" "So the personal notary of this rich man is my half-brother Igor. Didn't you know? He's the one who told me that James intends to make a will in favor of... You don't know who you're talking to, you know? So I decided to use your Emily. What's the beauty to waste? Let her work off the stipends and good treatment." Philip grinned in agreement. He had chosen reality TV for a reason, beautifully ambitious, and smart as that professor. Jessica was a shepherdess from the village, in a word. No brains, no imagination. The only thing Philip was worried about was that James Harrison would die before he could take his daughter as his wife. And if he does, the money will quite expectedly flow into his Alyosha's pockets, and being a wife will wait. All the same, one of them is not his own, and the other is unloved. So what's the fuss? It's better to go to the sea with Rose to rest for a week or two on the sand to fry, get water to treat themselves, to rest, so to speak, from the labors of the righteous, he thought. When Emily left the restaurant, she realized that she just had to see Ben, who'd been feeling better lately. Despite the fact that the guy practically merged, he did not leave the walls of the House of Mercy and began to help not with the sick as an orderly, which is quite a worthy occupation, especially given the specifics of the work. After all, Emily knew very well that vagrants were extremely reluctant to seek help in medical institutions. It is understandable. One has problems with the law, the other has no documents. But when the homeless saw Ben, they knew he was just like them. I mean, he's a poor bastard, a tumbleweed. But how can you not believe him when just yesterday he was collecting empty bottles, scrap metal, and waste paper side by side with you? Ben saw Emily and smiled and waved. "Hey, how's it going?" the guy asked cautiously. She only waved back. "What are you talking about? What business is there? Nothing but trouble. I had to save my..." Ben's face paled. "My fiancé. I didn't know you had a boyfriend." Emily smiled. "Come on, why are you jealous?" "What boyfriend? That's just me joking around. My father's got some kind of combination to get me into a fake marriage to pay off his debt. Only I don't like the whole thing." "Oh, I love it," Ben exhaled in relief. "I was getting upset thinking I'd never see the light of day without you." Emily shook her head with a smile. "You can't even think about that. It's okay. I think that after what happened, Dad will give up on his idea because it doesn't make any sense now." The young people talked some more, and then Emily went home, and Ben continued to work at the homeless shelter. It was always a busy place. The old building was crying out for repairs, but there was no money for it. So they had to screw something on and off and patch things up until their muscles ached. But no sooner had Emily reached the bus stop than her smartphone rang in her purse. Picking up the phone, she was surprised to hear an unfamiliar male voice. "Good afternoon. Emily Jamison Adamson." "Yes, it's me. What's up?" she asked confusedly. There was an awkward pause on the other end of the wire, after which the same ingratiating voice continued. "And I'm Igor Thompson. Perhaps you've heard of him." "No. Why would I have heard of it?" Emily marveled. "Well, if only because I'm a family notary specifically working with James Harrison." Emily shrugged. "So what of it? I'm neither cold nor hot about it." "Well, I can see what's what, after all. Anyway, I'll get to the main point. Tell me, would you mind coming to my office? Let's say in half an hour. It's not far away, Communal Street, Building 8. You'll see the sign there, it's prominent, so you won't miss it." Emily raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Come to you. Why?" "Why? Well, I'll answer it. It's about James Harrison's will," the notary replied. "Well, will? Is he dead? I saw him just a couple hours ago," Emily exclaimed. "No, he's not dead, just admitted to the hospital. But there are arrangements for that as well. So let's not waste each other's time. Anyway, everyone, I'm waiting. Come." Emily wanted to object, but the notary had already interrupted the call, leaving her standing in the middle of a street in confusion. "Okay, whatever, I'll go." What else did they come up with in there? Emily whispered and walked in the opposite direction. What was her amazement when at the notary's office she saw her parents and some woman with a very rough appearance and long legs. As it turned out a little later, the stranger's name was Rose Prudnikova, and she too had her own interest in the case. "Emily, what are you doing here? Didn't that crazy rich guy invite you to this show?" Philip exclaimed. Emily only shrugged uncertainly. "I came because I was told to come. But what claim can there be?" Fortunately, the notary didn't beat around the bush, and after inviting all the participants in the proceedings to come inside, got down to business. "I have gathered you here to announce the decision of James Harrison. Who wants to make his will public early? Is that even possible?" "How is that even possible? You mean I'm going to die tomorrow and you're going to be the heir today? What nonsense is that?" exclaimed Philip, who felt extremely uncomfortable being near his mistress. Rose was making eyes at him, not the least bit embarrassed by his wife's presence. After Philip's words, the notary grimaced and, after a pause, continued. "I repeat once again for those who do not understand. James Harrison has his own view of the situation, and only he has the right to decide when his will be announced to all present. So I'll tell you at once, all financial assets, real estate, the firm, James Harrison is going to leave on the line of Philip Adamson." From astonishment, the young nurse almost collapsed in a faint. "How can I? It must be a mistake. Then tell me it's a prank. Am I caught in the lens of a hidden camera?" The notary smiled. "No, Emily Filipovna. The possibility of a mistake is ruled out. Not only that, you became an heiress by right of descent. That is, being the daughter of James Harrison." "There's a daughter? We took Emily from the orphanage," Jessica shouted. "Well, yes, that's the way it was. That rich man must be out of his mind," Philip chimed in. She measured him with a scornful glance. "No, James Harrison's head is quite all right. There is a forensic medical report dated February 20 of this year that Emily Filipovna is his daughter. If you'd like to read it." February 20th. "But then I didn't even talk to James about marrying off my daughter in payment of the debt. How could he have known all this, and why did he make the will in advance?" Philip did not hold back. Then there was an awkward pause. No one present dared to break it. At that moment, Rose came on the stage, and first of all, she gave her lover a glare and did it defiantly in front of Jessica. "So you're asking, how did James know about all of this?" Rose began in a languid voice. From me, of course. Who else would it be from? All this time, I've been working for James and infiltrating your confidence to instill the idea that you absolutely had to marry your daughter off to him." Philip turned pale, then began gulping for air with his mouth like a beached fish. "But why did you do it? What was the point of it? And how could Emily be his daughter?" Rose smiled. "Very simply. Years ago, James broke up with a girl named Erin. who, without knowing it herself at the time of the altercation, was pregnant by him. Can you guess what happened next? Emily's biological mother suffered from a rare form of blood disease and passed away 3 days after giving birth. That's how Emily ended up in an infant home, from where she was safely taken by you and your spouse. Jesus. So I've been raising James Harrison's daughter all this time, just to please him, Philip burst out. But Rose was not impressed. As it turned out later, James Harrison only found out about his daughter's existence 6 months ago when the donor sample bank gave him a 100 match. That's when the businessman realized that all this time his daughter was around. True, she lived in the family of his subordinate, but who cares? The main thing is that he really did have a daughter. In addition, James had long wanted to expose his manager in fraud, so they sent me Rose with a special task. The businessman wanted to see if the foster father would pass a background check or sell his daughter for money. Since Philip had chosen the second option, James Harrison decided to act as the situation dictated. Now, if Philip hadn't given his daughter away and protected her, the businessman would probably never have been able to tell Emily about his relationship to her. But things turned out the way they did. Seeing her adoptive father in such an unflattering light, Emily waved her hand and left the notary's office in tears. Her mother ran out after her and decided to get a divorce. Frankly speaking, she had previously suspected her spouse of infidelity, but this case was the last straw. On the way to the hospital where her father was lying, Emily told her mother about Ben, that she was in love with him. I peery sincerely. Good for you, daughter. I hope you'll be happy with him. Half an hour later, Emily, Jessica, and Ben were gathered in the room of James Harrison, who had come to his senses and was looking at his daughter with tears in his eyes. And when Ben publicly asked the businessman for his daughter's hand in marriage, James Harrison was over the moon. Responding with approval, the businessman blissfully closed his eyes. Perhaps this was his male happiness, the very thing when you want to go on living no matter what. There is for the sake of whom, and also to successfully fight the disease to dance at the wedding of his daughter, whom he had found only 6 months ago. A teacher rescued an orphan boy, and a short time later found herself on the street. Pete leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He stayed late at the office, reviewing reports on the financial status of his restaurants. He had a whole chain of them now. The numbers were encouraging. Business was booming, not without problems, of course. Often there were various incidents that had to be regulated and cleaned up. That's business. But in general, the restaurants flourished, which of course could not help but encourage. Who'd have thought it? Years ago, Pete was starving, dreaming of a portion of fries and a patty, a piece of chocolate cake, a glass of milkshake with foam. And now he's feeding half the town on his own. Yeah, life's a director. Pete's really rich now, big business, bank accounts. He can afford to travel anywhere in the world, expensive cars, clothes from famous designers. True, here are the trappings of a luxurious life. All this tinsel is not for him. Most importantly, the man now does not need help, he helps himself. It is so nice to be able to make someone a little happier. Pete regularly transfers money to foundations that raise money for the treatment of people, and of course sponsors several orphanages. Most of these institutions are located in New York, where Pete has been living for more than 20 years. The man does not ignore the orphanage in Sandersville. Sandersville is a small provincial town. Dusty streets with broken sidewalks, weedy squares overgrown with weeds. It's a place of desolation and tranquility. It's where Pete spent his childhood. The man often reminisces about his early years, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Pictures from the past sometimes rise up before his eyes by themselves. Pete doesn't chase these memories away. On the contrary, he likes to think about the fact that he was able to get out of the pit, to stand, to survive, to become strong. In addition, his own story does not let him forget that there are many boys and girls in the world who need support and attention. His children's son and daughter are already old enough to talk to them about serious things. Andrew is in the 8th grade. Jessica is a year younger. Pete has long since told them about his life. At their age, he had a hard time. Children need to know that the world is not equally fair and kind to everyone. Both Andrew and Jessica are lucky. Everything comes easy to them, so to speak, by birthright. But that doesn't mean that others are doing the same. Son and daughter are well aware of how many disadvantaged children in the world and empathize with these people. That especially pleases their father. Andrew sometimes travels to orphanages together with Pete. They see everything, know everything, and even created their own group and social networks to help orphan children. They collect clothes, toys. Good guys. Pete was afraid that he would spoil his heirs too much, and he didn't want his son and daughter to turn into soulless snobs. Such a fate often awaited the children of wealthy parents. Pete had seen enough of such offspring. Permissiveness, indifference to other people's misfortune, confidence that the world revolves only around them. It's a sight to behold. Pete did his best to make Andrew and Jessica grow up sensitive, empathetic, attentive. And he was succeeding. They were doing it. His wife, Esmeralda, supported him in everything he did. They've known each other for years, almost a lifetime. Esmeralda also grew up in an orphanage. The girl was abandoned in the maternity hospital after she was born. Quiet, shy, unrequited, just like Pete. She'd long been the butt of local leaders' jokes, a punching bag. A person to assert herself, take out her frustrations on. Pete was the same way. He tried not to run into the guys, lived in constant fear, flinched at every rustle or loud sound. He had become strong for her sake, for Esmeralda's sake. He could not stand up for himself, but it was also unbearable to see this girl, who was quiet in her big eyes, being insulted. They became friends with Esmeralda. At first they played together, discussed some problems and worries. Both of them had no one to share their joys and sorrows with, but in each other they saw attentive interlocutors, support and acceptance. Later, somehow imperceptibly, all this grew into romantic feelings. And then Pete's life changed abruptly. From the miserable orphanage with its gray, shabby walls, stinking mattresses and scanty porridge in the morning, he suddenly found himself in a completely different world. No, Pete wasn't adopted. He was a teenager at the time. Who wants one of those? People prefer to adopt cute little babies. That's not what happened. Pete lived with a family until he was 9, and it was a wonderful family. The man's heart still ached when he thought of his parents. It's a shame they can't see what their son has accomplished. Too bad Pete couldn't do something nice for them. He had a lot of money now, and fulfilling his mother and father's dreams wasn't a problem for him. Dad kept talking about a new car because the old 6 was always breaking down. Mom wanted to go to the sea. She had been to the resort only once and now dreamed of repeating this trip. Except that they'd been gone for over 30 years. Pete and his family didn't live poorly, but they were never poor. They had a clean, cozy one-bedroom apartment in which the young heir was allocated a whole room. There was an old car. On it, my father took the whole family to the river, then in the woods. These were wonderful trips, even if not to the sea. Pete never went hungry. Yes, sometimes there was not enough money for candy or ice cream, but there was always a pot of borscht or goulash in the refrigerator. Mom worked as a painter. Dad worked at the factory and the shop. There was enough money to live on. We didn't live poorly, but we weren't poor. Pete didn't think about such things at all then. He enjoyed life, a quiet, sunny childhood, socializing with his parents and friends. His mother and father never quarreled. At least Pete didn't remember that. They never raised their voices at their son either, even if he did something wrong. His parents always talked to Pete like an adult, always explained the consequences of his behavior, told him what excessive carelessness could lead to. Pete, in turn, tried not to upset them. He studied well and did not bully. Attitude is more important than anything else in this world, his father had said many times. We have no one else, only us. And that's why it's important for us to protect each other. Pete liked those conversations. He saw their family as a close-knit team. Mom, Dad, Pete, they were each other's rock. It was wonderful to have that kind of support behind him. Pete learned that both his parents had grown up in an orphanage. Sometimes one of them would tell stories about those years. Pete listened to these stories with his mouth open. Mom and Dad's childhood was very different from his own. Different teachers, angry children, a life of starvation. And no one, absolutely no one, cared about these boys and girls. Pete was glad that he lived with loving and understanding parents. Then the boy could not imagine that one day he himself would end up in an orphanage. He could not have dreamed of such a thing. He has a mom and dad, they love him very much. And for complete happiness he lacked grandparents. Many friends had them, and it's great to drink tea with grandmother's cakes, to go fishing with his grandfather. But what can you do? That's life. But his parents are the best. Pete remembered that warm summer day forever. He still sometimes dreamed of flying on his scooter into his hometown yard through the archway. The cool gloom was replaced by bright sunlight and heat. The smell of heated grass hits his nose. Next to me is Lexi, a loyal friend and comrade. They've been sitting at the same desk since first grade. Lexi laughs, talking about something. And Pete. He immediately notices the crowd of neighbors outside his driveway, and his tiny heart clenches with misgivings. Pete still could not understand how he, 9 years old, at first sight then guessed that his parents are in trouble. The boy suddenly wanted to see his mom or dad. Right now, as it usually happens, they would dispel his fears. But his parents had gone to the village in the morning to buy meat. They often visited the local collective farm. The products there were fresh, real, useful. That's what Mom said. Pete often went with them, and he loved these mini vacations. Sitting in the back seat, looking at the road, and there were all fields and hills. It's picturesque. Mother and father are quietly talking about something, making plans. It's nice, peaceful. There's a lot of interesting things in the village itself. Even the smell is different there. Mom always wrinkles her nose, says, "It smells like manure, but Pete likes it for some reason." There are a lot of animals in the village, horses, cows, and goats. It's a common thing for the local kids. And Pete always looked at these animals, opening his eyes in amazement. But that day, the boy stayed home. Lexi suggested scooters at the new park. There are special paths and a fountain recently opened. How could he resist? The parents didn't mind. They always took their son's opinion into account, even when he was a baby. "All right, stay home, if you want," Mom said with a smile and brushed Pete's hair back. "We'll bring you something good to eat," Dad promised, sitting down in the driver's seat. Pete nodded happily. He and Lexi saw their parents off together, standing in the driveway, and of course at the time he couldn't even think about seeing them for the last time. The boy waved goodbye to them, and then headed off with his friend to adventure. It was a wonderful day. Pete and Lexi had a lot of fun riding on the new paths, getting to know the local kids. Splashing in the fountain, their friends had time to climb trees, play with a stray dog, and chase pigeons. It was fun. Summer vacation is the best time. So it was until the moment that divided the boy's life into before and after. The change began at the moment when Pete noticed the neighbors in his driveway. These people, familiar from his earliest childhood, looked anxious, worried, confused. They were discussing something. Lexi hadn't noticed them yet. She kept telling Pete a joke, but he wasn't listening. The boy's attention was on the neighbors. He desperately wanted to see his mom or dad among them. They should have been back by now. But his parents weren't there, which was scary for some reason. It was really scary. Even his palms were sweating, and goosebumps ran down his back. Finally, one of the neighbors noticed Pete and Lexi. He said something to the others, and now there were about a dozen pairs of eyes staring at the friends. Immediately, the boy felt a large shiver begin to hit him. The first to hug Pete was Aunt Stacy, his mom's friend. She often came to their house for tea and always brought something tasty for the master's son. "Trouble," she said, looking into the boy's eyes. "There is trouble, terrible trouble. You must be strong." Neighbors told Pete that his father had lost control of the car, and the car at high speed went into the ditch. There was a pothole in the road. It hadn't been there before, but it was hard to see it right away. The fault of the road service. Now the dangerous area has been fenced off, no one else will get hurt. But Pete's parents died in that terrible accident. Both of them. That was a hard thing to realize. It's even harder to accept. How could it be? Mother and father were something fundamental, something unshakable. Pete even lost consciousness for a while. He woke up at Aunt Stacy's. She was home in time to call an ambulance. The doctors came and gave the boy some kind of injection. Everyone looked at Pete with sympathy, stroked his head, hugged him. That made it even scarier. The boy did not think about his future. He was in a very strange state. Everything around him suddenly faded, somehow slowed down. Pete saw the world as if from the outside, as if he was just an observer, not a participant in this life. The neighbors took care of the funeral. Pete was staying with Aunt Stacy. He didn't want to go home. It was scary to walk into an empty apartment with no mom and dad. Aunt Stacy had sent the kids to her mother-in-law's for a while. And she must have taken time off work, because Aunt Stacy was always with Pete, never leaving him for a minute. Aunt Stacy often cried when she thought the boy couldn't see or hear her. Next to Pete, she tried to speak in a cheerful voice, even sort of smiling. It looked unnatural. The boy didn't make it to his parents' funeral. They saw them off on their last journey, only friends and neighbors. Pete had a hysteria the night before. He screamed, sobbed, convulsed, which incredibly frightened not only Aunt Stacy, but also himself. The boy would have liked to calm down, but he just couldn't. They took him to the hospital, gave him some pills, gave him some shots, and everything around him became unimportant. Pete lay on the bed and stared up at the white hospital ceiling. Not a very exciting thing for a boy to do. But it didn't seem that way to Pete at the time. A few days passed. The boy seemed to come to his senses. Neighbors were allowed to visit him. In the hospital courtyard, the boy sat on a bench between Aunt Stacy and Aunt Esmeralda. Both had their arms around his shoulders. Across from him stood more people from their home. They were all sad, even gloomy. "You'll have to stay at the orphanage for a while," Aunt Stacy said at last, her voice trembling. "We'll visit you," Aunt Esmeralda added. Pete shuddered. Until now, he hadn't thought about where and with whom he would live. There was too much on his mind at once. And now, hearing the phrase orphanage, the boy was alarmed, frightened. How could it be? His mom and dad had grown up in an orphanage. They had said many times that their son was very lucky to be born in a family. And now he would have to go to an institution like this. Tears came to the boy's eyes. He tried to force them inside, but nothing worked. Neighbors calmed him down, promised to visit him and even take him to their homes for the weekend, if the management of the orphanage allowed it. But Pete realized then, at the age of 9, sitting on a bench in the hospital courtyard, he realized that now he was alone, all alone, no more of their wonderful team. From now on, he would have to make his own way. Something told the boy that it would be difficult. He had to pull himself together, prepare for a long struggle. But at the time, he had no idea what he'd be up against. Looking ahead, it should be said that the neighbors did visit the boy. At first, Aunt Stacy came most often, always dressed up, always with goodies, hugging Pete, asking him about his life. But then these visits became more and more infrequent and finally came to nothing. The boy was not offended. He understood everything perfectly. After all, he had to grow up sharply. People have their own affairs, their own worries. Not to the neighbor's boy their own problems to deal with. Pete was taken from the hospital by two women, one in a police uniform, the other in ordinary clothes. They did not talk to the boy, did not explain anything to him, only gave him dry orders: get in the car, get out. The orphanage at first glance resembled an ordinary kindergarten, which Pitye had visited not so long ago. The same long 3-story building, the same green yard with playgrounds. The policewoman, having signed some papers, left. But the second escort took Pete inside. The boy was shown how everything was organized in the orphanage: several bedrooms with modest beds, a dining room, a playroom, and classrooms. The orphanage was outside the city, so the children did not go to a regular school. Teachers came to visit them themselves. On the first day, Pete was beaten up by local boys just to show who was in charge and stronger. The girls saw this and giggled gloatingly. Then, when the teacher came to the noise, looking her in the eyes, these girls said that the newcomer himself fell down the stairs, when Pete also received from the teacher for carelessness. "You're good, you didn't complain and fight." One of the attackers said afterwards, "I did the right thing. We would have beaten you up even more for that." Pete didn't say anything. He didn't say anything to the teacher out of fear of incurring more anger. Certainly not out of a desire to keep his tormentors out of trouble. The woman just didn't care. She wouldn't help Pete in any way. There was no help to be had here at all. A hostile and evil world. The gray orphan days dragged on. It was hard to get used to it all. Instead of a small but own room, a bedroom for 20 bunks. Instead of mom's delicious homemade food and incomprehensible brew. Instead of acceptance and soulful conversations, complete indifference, at best indifference, or even anger and aggression. There were no friends here, no attentive neighbors. Pete was immediately disliked. He'd been a homeschooled child for 9 years. He'd been loved, pampered, cared for. And these children, most of them, had never known the comfort of home and the love of family. They all had hard fates and believed that those more fortunate were now their eternal debtors. Pete couldn't stand up to this bitterness, not yet at that time. He was shocked by the behavior of his peers. The world was opening up from a completely different perspective. Everything was out of whack. He had to adapt. Pete was often beaten, and it was impossible to predict what would come next time. The boy tried to stay out of sight of his abusers. But how can you do that if you have to sleep in the same bedroom with them every night? Pete was doused with water, tripped over, called names, insulted, spit on, thrown things at, and had to endure it all. Pete tried to make friends with these kids. Not that he liked them, not at all. He just wanted to make his life a little more peaceful and pleasant. But it wasn't working. He and these guys, they were like different species. They had no common ground, no common themes. The boys from the orphanage were bitter and understood only the language of force. They were very different from Pete's friends, like Tom or Jake. Pete realized later that life had made them like that. As an adult, strong and wealthy, he began to help orphanages. If the underprivileged boys and girls realized that at least someone cared, if they saw help, kindness, sympathy, maybe some of them would think that the world is not only aggression and anger. Pete really wanted to hope so. The man was glad that since the time of his childhood, many things in orphanages had become different. And when the favorite happy child had to adapt to a new life in an accelerated mode, schooling had begun. With surprise and annoyance, Pete realized that the lessons here are purely formal. The level of preparation of his classmates was incredibly low. Of course, Pete, who had always studied well, showed his abilities on the first day of school. It didn't happen on purpose. His classmates could not cope with the simplest tasks. They could barely read. Pete was very praised by the teacher. Finally, a smart student, it's a pleasure to work with him, rejoiced Annie Smith. Pete smiled. He liked that he was finally noticed, that they were saying good things about him. But that very evening he was noticed by a crowd of boys in the backyard. The girls, as always, watched from a distant distance and silently approved. "Here's to you, upstart," said the boys. "You think you're the smartest? Don't show off." Pete was hurt, offended, scared. But he learned his lesson well. He didn't shine his knowledge in class anymore. He kept quiet. He made mistakes on his tests on purpose. Just so he wouldn't be praised anymore. Just so he wouldn't stand out. Just so he wouldn't stand out. Esmeralda was Pete's classmate. She didn't belong to any group of girls, and was friends only with the same quiet girls she was. These girls were often the objects of cruel jokes from their peers. The boys didn't touch them, usually preferring to deal with their own. But Pete quickly realized that girls could sometimes be even more cruel than boys. They made up insults for Esmeralda and her friends that would make people's ears perk up. They also spoiled their belongings, made them take their place on duty, and took away the treats the children were occasionally given in the dining hall. Sometimes there were scuffles with girls in the yard with bites, torn hair, and broken noses. The educators looked the other way. They preferred not to delve into children's conflicts, separated and punished everyone. But some teenagers were simply feared by adults, who knew about these children's past and guessed what they were capable of. It was easier for them to lock quiet Esmeralda in a closet for 24 hours than to deal with those who bullied. Pete had been locked up in that closet more than once for nothing, if that's what it took. But he even liked it there, quiet, dark, calm, no one yanking him around, calling him to get out, calling him names. Just sit there and think. One bad thing: hunger quickly began to pester the growing body. Life in the orphanage was half-starved as it was, and then there was punishment. But Pete eventually got used to it. As the years passed, Pete and Esmeralda had already become firm friends, already even began to show between them romantic feelings. The homeboy had changed. He became stronger, more resilient, learned to fight back. And it was all thanks to Esmeralda. It was unbearable to watch a crowd of girls bullying her. Then in the corner she is squeezed and start pinching. Then forced to duty in the kitchen every day. Then she has to wash their socks in the bathroom. A whole mountain of socks. But he couldn't take it. Pete saw the girls kicking the unrequited Esmeralda again one day, and he stood up for her. He knew exactly what he was doing. The girls were taken aback at first, and then they started laughing. Not laughing. One of them, the strongest and toughest, pushed Pete against the wall. The blow was hard enough, but the boy stood his ground and pushed her back. Actually, of course, you can't hit girls. Pete had learned that in his past life when he was in kindergarten. But in front of him now was not a girl, but a monster, unpleasant, angry, and ruthless. The girls, accustomed to resolving conflicts by swearing and fighting, pounced on Pete. But even though he was a puny boy, still a boy, he fought back quite well, and at the same time he understood perfectly well that the girls would call for help from the boys. It would be more difficult with them. Pete had been practicing hammering his fists with a flour sack in the closet for a long time, secretly from everyone. This bag replaced his punching bag. He did push-ups, pull-ups. He had to accept the rules of the game. If in this world the strongest survives, what does it mean to become the strongest? "Fool, you'll be in trouble now," warned one of the girls, the recognized leader of the company. The ladies realized that they could not overpower the boy and proudly withdrew. Pete knew exactly what their threats meant. They would tell their buddies. They would take revenge on Pete for his courage. Trouble did loom ahead. But Esmeralda looked at him as a savior, as a hero, and all distant problems under that gaze somehow faded, lost importance. "Thank you," she whispered quietly. "But what about you now? They'll get you, won't they?" Nothing. Pete waved his hand. "I'm not afraid of them." And at that moment he really wasn't afraid of reprisals. He didn't care. What mattered was that Esmeralda was looking at him in a special way and smiling. They sat together on the bench for a long time afterward and chatted about this and that, learning new things about each other. It turned out that Esmeralda's mother had died in the maternity hospital. She seemed to be a very young girl. The relatives didn't want to take the baby. It was an embarrassment to them. So Esmeralda lived from infancy in children's institutions. Apparently, such a fate of a granddaughter, in the opinion of relatives, was not a disgrace. That was her story. Of course, payback caught up with Pete very soon. "Are you the coolest guy in the world now?" was the question one of his attackers asked him. The question was, of course, purely rhetorical. Of course, Pete was beaten, and badly. The girls were nearby. They suggested to their defenders ways to humiliate the victim, one more sophisticated than the other. But that time Pete still fought back. He managed to break a couple of noses, kick someone in the stomach, and then found himself in the dust on the ground. And he was the only one who got hit. But still the boys were surprised. Before, the victim was wordless and toothless, and then suddenly it was like this. He was less likely to be touched. No one wanted to get punched in the teeth or nose by a mob. And there was the occasional one-on-one attack. No, not anymore. Pete sighed, stretched, turned off the computer. Time to go home. Tomorrow he could sleep in a little longer, spend time with his family. The man threw on his coat, walked out of the office. His car was parked in the back of the restaurant. Where the garbage cans stood, food that customers got fed up with was thrown into them. So homeless people who wanted to satisfy their hunger often hung around here. Pete wasn't surprised to see an elderly woman in tattered clothes and shot sneakers, clearly off someone else's foot, standing next to the bins. Pete didn't chase the homeless away from the bins. On the contrary, he asked the staff to leave the food in the containers on the site, not to throw it all in the bucket. He felt sorry for these destitute people. Poor thing, he thought. But the woman, smelling the presence of a man, was frightened, shuddered, turned around. She looked anxiously at him. Pete was dumbfounded. This old woman? No, such a thing is simply impossible. She was very much like the man who had once played a pivotal role in his life. The man gazed intently into the poor woman's face. The woman also looked at him studyingly. After a few years of surviving in the orphanage, an amazing thing happened in Pete's life. A new English teacher, Laurel Swan, came to visit. The class, as always, began to test her on the first day. Mean jokes, attempts to disrupt the lesson, even direct insults. Usually the teachers either lost it or lost their temper. But Laurel Swan looked at the troublemakers with sadness and even pity. It was amazing. Pete, who, as always, was ashamed of his classmates, watched Laurel Swan with interest. This was an unusual person. It was immediately felt. The new teacher had an interesting lesson. She didn't torture the class with the necessary rules, but turned on cartoons in English. The pupils at first, out of habit, only tried to make jokes, but somehow they got involved. Even the most disinterested in learning bullies. Then Laurel Swan began to ask questions. Pete, to his own surprise, knew all the answers. As he answered, the teacher shook her head approvingly and smiled. She seemed to be impressed by the able pupil. She hadn't expected to find such a one here. Pete was no longer afraid of being pushed and taunted by the local bullies, so he answered as he saw fit. "You're an amazingly talented boy," she praised Pete when the others had left. And he realized that the teacher purposely did not shower him with compliments in front of his classmates so as not to arouse their envy. What an intelligent and sensitive person, Pete thought. "Thank you," said the embarrassed and delighted Pete. It had been a long time since anyone had been so attentive to him. "Tomorrow I'll bring you some textbooks to study with the kids. What about you? You should be interested in something else," Laurel said. And indeed, the next lesson she brought a bright, colorful textbook. There were many fascinating stories in the form of comics. "We will repeat the material with the students for now," said the teacher. "You don't need it." "Read it and tell me if you understand it," Laurel Swan said to Pete. Pete delved into the reading. The bright pictures were pleasing to the eye. The boy was engrossed in the story, and he didn't notice how the lesson flew by. "Did you understand anything?" Laurel Swan leaned over the desk with a smile. "I understood everything, but I didn't have time to finish it. Too bad." "Interesting," Pete said. "Take the book with you. You'll have time to read it." "Yeah, you do?" "I bought it for my daughter, but she didn't seem interested." "Let it serve someone," the teacher added. Laurel Swan made Pete's life happier and more pleasant, gave it a special meaning, and the other children liked her a lot too. It was a rare teacher who interacted with the class not through humiliation and insults, but through explanations, frank conversations on the heart. Both girls and boys were drawn to her. But it was obvious to everyone that Laurel Swan was Pete's favorite. But there were no objections. The classmates saw that Pete was making great progress in English. He helped them too. He never said no to anyone, even the ones who had recently beaten him up in the backyard. Pete devoured one after another of the interesting English books Laurel Swan brought him. Then the teacher handed the boy a player with several CDs. "Reading is one thing," she said. "You could use some listening too. English is a little hard to listen to, but you'll do fine. I know." "Thank you," Pete said, but he looked at the player with doubt. "It's expensive. There's no guarantee that the boys won't take it away from me. I'm afraid I can't take it." Laurel Swan seemed to understand. "I'll make a deal with the principal," she said. "He'll let you into the classrooms after school at certain hours when no one is here. That's where you'll study. Is that all right with you?" "Of course it is," Pete exclaimed. It was so nice to do something he loved and enjoyed in the silence of an empty classroom. It was not only learning English, but also a great opportunity to be alone with himself. This privacy Pete really lacked in the orphanage. And this is beautiful. Pete often talked to Laurel Swan about more than just English. They had become almost real friends. Pete told his teacher about his tragedy. It was so nice to share moments from the past with someone. The woman shook her head, sighing from time to time. "Oh, you've had a hard time, Pete," she said. Not always the conversations between the teacher and the able pupil were so heavy and serious. Sometimes they laughed and joked, sometimes they discussed the news, sometimes they argued, and sometimes they were happy to find that they agreed. Esmeralda liked Laurel Swan too, but she was shy of the teacher. A girl of that age in general was afraid of everyone and everything. Pete saw that life in the orphanage had a negative effect on Esmeralda. Kind and sensitive by nature, she couldn't stand the pressure. At least now Esmeralda had him, Pete. He wouldn't let her get hurt. One day Laurel Swan suggested Pete enter a regional competition. He had to write an essay in English, decorate it with drawings, and send it to New York. "Why, you've got a great imagination and a high level of language skills. You'll do great," said the teacher. "Well, I don't know," Pete hesitated. "Who is he?" "A kid from the orphanage. The other kids are homeschooled. They go abroad and tutor. How can he compare to them?" "I know," said Laurel Swan confidently. "All you will succeed." "What's there to write about?" Pete asked. "The theme is summer vacation. Describe the perfect day of your happiest vacation. I think that would be good." Pete thought for a moment. He knew right away what kind of day he would write about. Mom and Dad were still with him then. They both had the day off. They got up early, got in the car, and drove into the woods to get mushrooms. That day they saw a deer up close. The deer jumped out onto the road, gave the men a worried look, even trembled. And then suddenly, as if it realized that these people were not dangerous. By some inner instinct the deer guessed, and just went about its business. It began to nibble the grass, letting them admire themselves. It was a real miracle. All three of them froze, watching the cute animal. Then there was a wonderful picnic in the woods. Mom made her signature pies with onions and eggs, which Pete loved so much. We picked a lot of mushrooms. In the evening, Dad fried potatoes with them. Adrian showed up at the smell. He lived one floor down, and he knew what was coming. "And here you are, you lazybones," he exclaimed. All three of them started talking about Adrian. "Will you take me next time?" the boy asked with hope in his eyes. "Of course we will," his father promised. "And that was today too. Should I take you with me?" Well, did not guess something. But the promised joint trip never happened. Instead, Pete ended up in an orphanage. I wonder how Lexi is doing now. All grown up, I guess. Does he still remember his childhood friend, Pete thought. At that moment, he didn't know and couldn't know that not only had Lexi not forgotten him, but he was trying to make his way back to him. But it was difficult. The orphanage and its grounds were behind a high, blank fence. In addition, the site itself was located far away from the city. Lexi was just a kid. Still, he had come to the gate several times and begged the guard to let him in, or at least to send word to his friend. The guard invariably turned the boy away. Of course, he never sent any message to Pete. Juvenile visits were not allowed. Lexi's parents were going through a divorce and couldn't handle their son's requests. He begged them to go to Pete's with him, but to no avail. "I don't have time," they said. And then, when the parents took pity on Lexi, well, how did they take pity? It was just a fight over who the son loved more. During this period, each parent tried to fulfill Lexi's every wish. Anyway, Lexi's dad called the orphanage to arrange a date. But Pete was no longer there. He was transferred to another place. And all thanks to Laurel Swan, her faith in a talented student. Pete learned all of this later, when Lexi found an old friend on social media. They met as if the years apart had never happened. Lexi is still Pete's best friend, reliable, loyal, always there for him. Laurel Swan insisted. Pete took the essay. It was a passion for the boy. It was so nice to remember that happy day. Esmeralda helped her friend and took care of the design. Pete was not much of a draftsman, but she was very good at it. Esmeralda drew a deer so cute, and most importantly, so remarkably similar to the deer Pete had once seen. "I've never been in the woods," she smiled sadly. "We'll go for a walk with you. When we grow up, will we get out of here? I wish we could. Maybe life will be better later." "It will be. I've lived there. It's really nice there," Pete said. He was still surprised that Esmeralda had spent her whole life in those walls and had no idea what most people were like. Well, she would have a pleasant surprise when she left the orphanage. The essay won the prize and went to the all-Russian stage of the contest. Only this stage was not absentee. It was required to come to New York in person. The format was as follows: each participant goes on stage and receives a task from the jury to compose a story on a certain topic. You have to orient yourself lightning fast, improvise, fantasize. "You can do it. You can definitely do it," Laurel Swan excitedly paced the class. "You can win. I know you can. And the prize is a ticket to the future. Free education in a boarding school for gifted children. It's a really worthwhile institution. If you get there, you're lucky, and that's it. You'll become a successful person. Graduates from there are supervised and guided. First, the most prestigious universities queue up, and then employers. You have every chance, every right to have that future." Pete, who of course was already thinking about the future, realized how important it was for him to participate in this competition. It made him anxious and excited. What if he couldn't handle it? "I will prepare you," Laurel Swan continued, as if she had heard the thoughts of her promising student. "You are more worthy of this place than anyone else. We'll study hard. You'll do well." And indeed, Laurel Swan began to study with Pete separately on an accelerated program. The principal was happy about that. If his pupil won a competition of this level, it was a big plus for their orphanage. He allowed Pete and Laurel Swan to take the class after school, and even provided them with everything they needed: a VCR, a laptop, a record player. It's not enough, Laurel Swan worried. We have to do it on the weekends too. I'll talk to the principal. Maybe he'll let you come to my house on weekends, because you have a great potential, but you don't have enough base. You have to work hard, and everything will work out. The director said it's okay. Moreover, he even allocated money from the budget of the orphanage for bus fare. Not a huge sum, but still, for the first time in many years, Pete was alone in the city. He waited for the right bus, got on the empty seat. It was so nice to ride through the city like that, looking out the window. Laurel Swan met him at the bus stop. It was a little unusual to see her outside the school office, but it was nice too. Their path wound through the park. They chatted, laughed, joked. Pete suddenly imagined that he was just an ordinary kid. He was no different from the boys around him, was he? And there he is, walking next to his aunt or even his mom. They're talking about something, smiling. It's a typical picture. The people around them don't realize that this is what happiness looks like. For them, it's all routine. It's amazing how complicated life is, Pete thought. There's my house, Laurel Swan said. Pete looked around at the high-rise buildings. A standard dwelling and a typical yard. He'd lived in one like it with his parents, and he'd go back there to his own apartment. When he turned 18, Laurel Swan's apartment was exactly like his parents', which made it seem familiar. 2 rooms, a small but cozy kitchen. Pete looked around with interest. It was obvious that Laurel Swan was not a rich man. Simple furniture, inexpensive wallpaper. But there was a special atmosphere in these rooms, warm, soft, soothing. It must be nice to live here. Pete knew Laurel Swan had a daughter, Linda, about his age. I'd love to meet her. Laurel Swan must have raised an interesting person. The boy hoped it would be wonderful to be friends with the teacher's daughter if he could make another friend. There were so few of them in his life, after all. The teacher never talked much about her daughter. They discussed all sorts of things, but not Linda. That was even more interesting. The boy had no idea what she was like. But as soon as Linda entered the apartment, Pete realized that they were unlikely to become friends. Laurel Swan was at that moment explaining to a student at the kitchen table the rules of constructing complex English sentences. A kettle was boiling on the stove, and an apple pie was cooking in the oven. Pete was anticipating a pleasant tea party, and then the door rattled open, and a teenage girl appeared on the doorstep. A daring miniskirt, revealing long, skinny legs with sharp knees, a tight top, thick platform shoes. Her short hair was dyed a strange green color, her large eyes thickly lined with black. Her eyelashes were clumped together from a thick coat of mascara. Pete stared at the girl in surprise. He had imagined Linda quite differently, not a Turgenevian young lady, of course, but not like that either. This Linda reminded him subtly of the aggressive girls from the orphanage. And it wasn't about her appearance. Well, maybe the girl likes this image? She has the right to express herself. The essence was something else: a cold, prickly look, contemptuously compressed lips, deliberately swaggering manner of movement. Linda, hello. Laurel Swan smiled at her daughter. This is Pete. I told you about him, remember? He's getting ready for the pageant. Hi, the boy waved his hand. Linda gave the guest a haughty look and turned to her mother, ignoring the greeting. Do you have anything to eat? I won't be long. Laurel Swan scurried to the refrigerator. Yes, of course, she said. I'll eat in my room, Linda said, and left. Pete was embarrassed by the scene. Linda appeared to be an insolent and boorish person. Laurel Swan seemed to be ashamed of her behavior. Soon, loud pop music came from the room. Laurel Swan took a plate of pilaf to her daughter. Pete could hear the teacher trying to get her daughter to turn the music down, as it was impossible to study in such a noisy environment. "It's my house. I do what I want. If he doesn't like it, let him go to his own place," was the rude reply. It didn't last long, though. Linda changed her clothes and found herself at the door again. This time she was wearing ultra-short shorts. "What are you looking at?" she said menacingly to Pete. "Do you like me?" Pete blushed. "Where are you going? When are you coming back?" Laurel Swan became alarmed. She hadn't made a single comment about her daughter's appearance. It would have been useless to do so, apparently. "None of your business," the girl said rudely and slipped out the door. "Well, now we can get on with the class," Laurel Swan smiled sadly. Why? Why is she like that? Pete couldn't help but wonder. After a moment, he realized that such talk could be unpleasant for the teacher. But Laurel Swan sighed sadly and sat down opposite him. "You're a big boy, you understand a lot of things," she said. "I just couldn't cope with raising my daughter. I will teach other children, but myself. A cobbler without boots." Laurel Swan raised Linda alone. She was never married at all. Linda's father was the kind of guy who avoided responsibility. An adventurous individual living the life of an adventurer. And this character once met on the way of a quiet, modest girl who, probably for the first time in her life, went with her friends to a disco. What attracted him to her? Maybe it was the fact that she was different from himself. Exotic, so to speak. Either way, it was not difficult for an experienced man to interest an unsophisticated young person. It wasn't even an affair. They spent about 24 hours together. The young lady was in slight shock at how many events contained in these hours. Where she had been, what she had seen. Linda's father knew how to be interesting, knew how to organize exciting leisure time. He tried on different roles and masterfully played them himself, enjoying it. The morning he vaporized, as if he was not there. The girl managed to fall in love with him. She was looking for a mysterious beau for a long time, but he seemed to disappear into the water. Most likely, he was irrepressible. Laurel Swan had a daughter to remember the tumultuous but short-lived affair. "I was even glad then," she said. "For a long time I hoped that he would come back. And here I am with a baby. I thought his heart would be moved. We will live together." Then I realized, of course, that it was all just nonsense. Laurel Swan by that time had already graduated from the Teacher Training Institute and managed to get a job at the local gymnasium. She had to go on maternity leave. Money was tight. Laurel Swan lived with her mother in this very apartment. The old woman's pension was small, and her child allowance seemed even smaller. So Laurel Swan took up tutoring, running around all day in other people's apartments. She pounded hard truths into the heads of mostly neglectful students. Their parents were willing to pay a lot of money to make their children speak English. But the children themselves did not want to learn the language. Laurel Swan had to break through the wall of reluctance, and sometimes even disgust. Not a very pleasant occupation. But it paid good money. Linda was being looked after by her grandmother, and she was the first to notice the warning signs. "Something she is some kind of too capricious. Always she is drawn somewhere," complained the old lady. "She doesn't listen to me at all. I punish her blindly, but she does not care. Today she cut off my favorite sweater with scissors to spite me." Especially still looked at me, waiting for a reaction, continued to complain grandmother. And then she said, "I'm sorry, Mom." "Well, something like that," Laurel Swan objected tiredly. And only 2.5 years old. What revenge? What disobedience? The child is just learning about the world, that's all. It's normal. Laurel Swan loved it when her daughter would run to the door in the evening. The first thing she did was to look in the bag, looking for something tasty, and always found a chocolate bar, or sweet fruit, or flavored buns. Laurel Swan did her best to please her daughter. Who else would make her happy? No father. Time passed. Linda went to kindergarten, where Laurel Swan returned to grammar school. That's where the trouble started. Now the teachers were complaining about Linda. She hits other kids, encourages the boys to play pranks, spits when she's in the wrong. The woman promised to talk to her daughter to improve the situation, and she did. But with her mother, Linda behaved like a real angel. It seemed that everyone was slandering the poor girl. The grandmother, the teachers. And then Laurel Swan's mother died suddenly, a heart attack, and the woman was left alone with her daughter. It was just about time for Linda to start first grade. But then Laurel Swan herself had to admit there was something wrong with her daughter. Linda categorically refused to learn. The girl was prepared for school at a fee-based center. They didn't talk about the problems there. Why scare clients who are paying good money? It turned out that Linda can neither read, nor write, nor operate even the smallest numbers. And worst of all, she doesn't want to learn those skills. Laurel Swan worked very hard. She practiced with her daughter every day, patiently endured her whims and reproaches. Only threats worked. Read the page, solve the examples, then you can go outside. Otherwise you'll stay home, Linda. The street beckoned to her with a terrible force. Sitting at home in four walls, it was for her like a prison. The girl shouted at her mother, called her names, threw notebooks and textbooks at the wall, and still had to fulfill the requirements of the parent. Then Linda was even weaker than her mother, physically weaker. And then, when she was older, Linda simply pushed Laurel Swan aside and went outside or ran away when she was at work. A woman couldn't guard her daughter 24 hours a day. Sometimes Linda just didn't make it home from school, going straight out to travel the neighborhood in the company of dubious friends. Laurel Swan was worried about her daughter and didn't know what to do. Prohibitions didn't help. In addition, Linda cheated, insulted her mother, took valuables from the house, which it seems then sold. She needed something to entertain herself with. Laurel Swan first smelled cigarettes on 10-year-old Linda. After getting drunk, the teacher's daughter showed up for the first time when she was 13. Laurel Swan talked a lot with her girl, told her how such behavior can turn out, what troubles await teenagers on the street. But Linda only smiled and looked down on her mother as if she were a fool. "What do you know about the free life, about the street?" she used to say. "You've spent your whole life fulfilling other people's wishes and expectations, parents, neighbors, and all that. And I don't care what people say. I was born free. And you're angry about it. I'm not like you." It was the truth. Linda, both in appearance and, most disturbingly, in character, took after the father she had never known or seen. There it was, the monstrous power of genes. The same frivolous adventurer, the same liar and actress, the same rule-breaking adventurer. Laurel Swan fought for her daughter. She still hoped that nurture could overcome genetics. The woman took Linda to psychologists and psychotherapists, tried to become more of a friend and give the girl more freedom. All in vain. The older Linda got, the more the chasm unfolded between them. It was so unlike Laurel Swan's relationship with her own mother. No warmth of heart, no mutual support, no shared interests. Linda seemed to despise her mother for her dull gray life, her poverty, her intellectualism. This girl herself considered herself an ideal. She could afford to do what she wanted. For example, to send the teacher in the classroom for the fact that she was picking on her appearance, or smoking on the school porch. Gradually, her parents became Linda's servants. Her mother fed her, made her money, gave her a roof over her head. She's necessary, only for this. True, she had to pay, listen to the occasional lecture. But Linda learned long ago to ignore them. Maybe it's just her age, Pete suggested after listening to Laurel Swan. There was so much pain in her eyes that he wanted something to comfort her. "That's what I hope," she replied. As time passes, Linda will calm down, come to her senses. Think about the future, so long as nothing bad happens to her in the meantime. I'm so scared for her. Well, we're getting a little distracted. You need to study. Open your textbook to page 3. Pete came to Laurel Swan's house every Sunday. They studied hard for the pageant. They also drank fragrant tea with delicious homemade pastries and talked about very interesting topics. Laurel Swan tried to answer all of Pete's questions. She didn't dismiss any of them. She was wise, empathetic, and worried. Sometimes Linda was home during these sessions. One day she piled into the hallway, drunk at 15. She reeked of booze, tobacco smoke, and the girl's legs were a mess. It was late morning. It looked like Linda hadn't been home last night. The girl passed out in the hallway. Pete helped the teacher drag her senseless body to the bed. It's just the way we live, Laurel Swan sighed later. Nothing works on her. Linda was even worse than the violent girls at the orphanage. Those were toughened by their hard fate and the need to fight for survival. And Linda, why? She has clothes and her own room and delicious food. And most importantly, such a wonderful mom. Once, in Pete's presence, Linda insulted Laurel Swan. She tried to ask her daughter if she would be back for dinner. The girl was irritated about something. She unleashed an angry tirade on her mother, and Pete stood up for Laurel. But she doesn't deserve to be treated like that, he said. And then something happened that the boy never expected. Linda jumped up and slapped him so hard that his eyes went black. "You're going to tell me what to do in my own house," she shouted. Linda's eyes burned with evil fire. "You bitch." From then on, Pete thought the girl was crazy sick. Well, it happens. Not necessarily. People with mental illness look like fools. Some of them are geniuses, he said. A normal person can't be like that. One day the boy even shared his speculations with his teacher. He was worried before the conversation, afraid to offend Laurel, but she realized that it was just an expression of concern for herself. No, there's nothing wrong with her mentally. I've had her seen by several psychiatrists since she was a baby. The verdict is clear, everything is within normal limits, Laurel replied. Pete didn't tell anyone about Laurel's daughter. The teacher didn't ask him specifically, but he understood it himself. He only shared it with Irina. They always told each other everything. Silly Linda doesn't understand her happiness, the girl shook her head. I wish I had such a mother. Irina felt sorry for the kind teacher. Other children were drawn to Laurel, even the worst bullies. And her own daughter? Closer to the date of the competition, one serious problem came to light. It turned out that the participants had to pay for their own transportation. And this is a lot of money, tickets for the child and the chaperone, a few days of hotel accommodation, meals. But no, I can't allocate such a sum. The director of the orphanage refused at once. Where from? We need to fix the roof. And it's fall, and many of the children have outgrown warm clothes. Pete heard Laurel Swan persuading the director of the orphanage, convincing him that Pete's participation in the contest was a chance for a normal life. Then she tried to prove that his win was good for the orphanage. You're going to get so many sponsors after this. They will fix the roof, buy clothes for the children, and make a sports field, she said. He still has to win. And where are the guarantees? Objected the director. He has great potential, no doubt. But I don't believe that our pupil could beat everyone at an event of this level and scale. Pete was catching every word, and everything was tightening inside him. Could it be that because of financial difficulties he would not even go to the competition? It turned out that he had practiced, tried, and hoped for nothing. The boy had a goal, a dream, and now he felt like the ground had been knocked out from under him. I'll think of something, Laurel Swan promised Pete, who was barely holding back tears. Don't worry, I'll find the money and we'll go to the pageant. You'll see. Laurel has since begun to pound the doorsteps of the administration. She even appealed to city businessmen, but apparently no one believed in the talents of the boy from the orphanage. No one was interested in the teacher's proposals. Pete saw how hard Laurel was working for him. He was very grateful to her for that. But he'd already accepted the fact that it wasn't going to work out. It was obvious. But one morning before school started, the teacher approached Pete. The boy was usually the earliest to get to class. He liked this quiet time in the morning, standing at the window, looking out at the street while the others bustled about before the next school day. "We're going," Laurel told Pete with shining eyes of joy. "I managed to find the right amount of money." "Where? How?" The boy's heart thumped in his chest like a captured animal. "There are still people who care," the teacher replied evasively. "The world is not without good people." Much later, on the eve of his departure, Pete learned that Laurel, having failed to achieve results, had simply taken out a loan. The payments were exorbitant for her, but she had decided to do it. Pete went to Laurel Swan's house on Sunday as usual. He hoped he wouldn't see Linda today, but she was home. "You should be glad you're going to Washington," the girl measured him with a scornful glance. "Your mother took out a loan because of you. She's always been a fool. She's always been a fool. She's always been stupid. Would not have her own daughter to buy brand-name sneakers. But no, she'd rather spend her money on something stupid. She's pissing me off on purpose." "Are you here for me?" Pete turned to Laurel. She suddenly blushed as if she'd done something embarrassing. She was embarrassed that Pete had found out the truth. "Don't think about it," she said. "I've been wanting to go to Washington myself for a long time. Anyway, it's such a chance. The principal's going to give me a raise after you win. I'll pay off the loan. It's okay." After that, Pete decided he was going to win. He would win at any cost. He couldn't let Laurel Swan down. And the kid won that pageant. Standing on the stage in the spotlight, he felt no excitement. His mind was clear and bright. It was a tough subject. You could say he was unlucky. But Pete did it. He gave such a monologue that the whole hall applauded him for a long time. The results were to be announced the next day. Objectively, you were the best, but it's possible Laurel was worried. You can't rule out Blatt connections. Pete was not among the winners. They announced third place, then second place. Laurel looked hopefully at the stage. Pete, however, was already convinced that it had failed. And then the announcer called out his name. The room erupted in applause. First place. Victory. And then it was all over in a flash. Pete didn't even realize it. He returned to the orphanage, where he was greeted as a winner should be greeted. Esmeralda even cried tears of joy. And Laurel Swan, she was glowing with happiness that everything had worked out. Soon people from the boarding school for gifted children came to pick Pete up. They spent a couple of days taking care of him. Some formal moments preparing documents, studying the boy's personal history. Pete realized that they were taking him somewhere to a new life, which he deserved, according to Laurel Swan. He had a future now. A brilliant future. Pete would become strong, smart, wealthy. He won the lucky ticket thanks to Laurel, of course, and the support of Esmeralda. They're the ones who are very hard to part with. They're the people closest to Pete. Esmeralda's a bit of a worry to leave behind. How's she going to be here without him for another 3 years? Who's going to protect her? Laurel promised to keep an eye on her. Still, it's scary and sad and hard. It would be a long time without seeing her loved ones. On the other hand, it's worth it to be patient for a few years. After all, then Pete will become an influential and wealthy man, will do everything for it. And then he would thank Laurel and make Esmeralda's life a fairy tale. The second point Pete managed to realize, not immediately, of course. First, the boy spent 3 years in a boarding school for gifted children. It was a real palace with a magnificent garden, a separate room, classrooms, equipped with the latest technology. Smart, motivated kids. Pete finally made friends here, local kids. He had a lot of common topics and interests, so friendships formed somehow by themselves. The teachers noticed the smallest abilities of their students and tried to develop them. They were very pleasant and educated people, communication with whom enriched and developed. But Pete had never had such a warm relationship with anyone as he had with Laurel. He often remembered his teacher, worried about whether it was hard for her to pay off the loan, whether Linda was hurting her. After graduating from boarding school, Pete entered the University of Washington without exams. During the years of study, the guy managed to win several Olympiads at the national level, which gave him special preferences. Many boarding school graduates entered prestigious universities in this way, without exams. Scholarship, dormitory, support of mentors who continued to supervise and accompany students even after graduation. Pete's life became easier, calmer, more interesting. While still a student, he found a job. He was hired by a large tour company as a translator. Pete began to earn good money. That's when he was finally able to return to his hometown. And he was eager to see Laurel and, of course, to find Esmeralda. Finding Esmeralda was no problem. The director of the orphanage gave the address of the apartment, which the girl received after graduation as a round orphan. It was some kind of barrack-type shanty town in the middle of nowhere. Always drunken neighbors, mountains of garbage everywhere. Esmeralda graduated from college and now worked as a dressmaker's assistant in an attire. She made a pittance, lived in a hole. "I never thought you'd come back." Esmeralda's eyes shone like two bright stars at the sight of Pete. "How grown up are you now? Are you handsome?" "How could I leave you?" Pete smiled, hugging her. "I missed you so much. You won't live here anymore. You won't stay a single day in this horrible house." That same evening, Pete helped Esmeralda move into her parents' apartment. It had been empty the whole time. The old neighbors were gone, the older ones had died. The younger ones had moved out. Too bad. It would have been nice to talk to old friends, Pete sighed. But the main thing is that Esmeralda will have a normal life now. I'll feel better. And it's nice to have a loved one living in my own apartment. It makes my soul feel warmer. But Laurel was never found. Her apartment was now occupied by new tenants. "The landlady sold it to us 2 years ago," said the woman in a bathrobe who opened the door for Pete. "She and her daughter had moved somewhere in the country, I think. I don't know the details. I don't need to know." Pete returned to Washington and continued to study and work. But now every vacation he returned home to Seattle, where Esmeralda was waiting for him. After graduation, Pete was hired by the State Department. The position was offered at once responsible and highly paid. As Laurel Swan had once assumed, winning a prestigious competition became Pete's ticket to life. Now he was being guided and supervised. The boy's life seemed to run on carefully laid rails. Everything seemed to work itself out. Pete bought an apartment in Washington. Esmeralda moved in with him. They got married. Pete was moving up the career ladder. He had to work hard, but it paid off. Esmeralda stayed at home, taking care of the children and the household. She sincerely enjoyed motherhood and loved her husband very much. Pete was pleased and warm to come home from work. The man made several more attempts to find Laurel, but to no avail. Her tracks were lost after moving out of her old apartment. Too bad for Pete. He so wanted to thank her again, so wanted her to see what he had accomplished. All her efforts were not in vain. A good woman deserves to be thanked, and not just verbal gratitude. After a few years, Pete realized that working in the ministry takes too much time and energy. He was missing out on happy and important moments. The son went to the first grade, but the father did not get to the lineup because of an urgent meeting. The daughter performed for the first time with a ballet group in the theater, but busy Pete at this time was conducting important negotiations, and the man decided to go into the restaurant business. The opportunity to open his own business presented itself. And now Pete has a chain of restaurants in the capital. He's his own boss. Work, of course, you have to work a lot, but the man is able to regulate his own schedule so that everywhere has time. And that's just great. Today he stayed up late with reports, but tomorrow he has a free day to devote to his family. Pete left the office with a feeling of accomplishment. On the street, he smiled at the anticipation of seeing his wife and children. And there's this old woman at the restaurant bins who looks a lot like Laurel Swan. That resemblance is frightening. But the woman at the dumpster certainly can't be Laurel. The teacher has a place to live, and she had a job, which means she has a pension. "Hello, Pete." The woman smiled sadly. "Is this how you've grown up? Handsome, mature, strong. Just like you always dreamed you'd be." "Laurel Swan?" Pete asked in disbelief. The woman nodded her head. Pete invited her into his office. On the way, they both expressed their joy at the chance meeting, each in their own way. Laurel smiled warmly and a little embarrassed. Pete was talking excitedly about his life and how long he had been looking for her. Finally, they were in Pete's office. "It's nice and cozy here," the man said, and gestured for Laurel to sit down on a comfortable couch in the corner, placed especially for visitors. Then he made coffee for the guest himself, put cookies in a plate for the visitors. Usually Lexi's secretary took care of the guests, but at this late hour, of course, she was at home. "Laurel, it's just amazing that we met. I've been thinking about you so much, looking for you for so long. I wanted you to know how much I've achieved thanks to you." "Thanks to yourself," the older woman corrected, looking at Pete with pride. "Talented, persistent, hardworking. That's what made it all work. You know very well that if it hadn't been for you, I don't know who I'd be now. A good man. You'd still be a good man without me, and you'd still be a success. Maybe not so soon. Of course, kids like you with a backbone, you can tell. You can trust me. I have a lot of experience." "But why you?" Pete hesitated, searching for words. "How did you end up in this position? It's obvious that you need." "It's obvious I'm old," Laurel Swan sighed. "And speak plainly." It was obvious that she was uncomfortable in front of her former student, ashamed that he could see her in this position. "Tell me," Pete asked. "Okay," Laurel nodded. "It's a long story, and I can't say I'm surprised by the ending. It was coming. After Pete was taken away to a boarding school for gifted children, I started having a lot of trouble with Linda. The 15-year-old girl was now often spending the night with who knows where, showing up home in the morning, or even a few days after she went missing. Sometimes she was brought by the police, whom I asked for help, because the girl was a minor. Exhortations, threats, heart-to-heart talks, everything was bypassed. I even tried to lock my daughter up when I went to work. I couldn't work, I had to live on something. But one day a freedom-loving person cleaned through the balcony, tied the sheets and went down them from the 4th floor. After that I stopped locking her up. It's dangerous. The teenager now spoke to her mother only in foul language. All the valuables, jewelry, appliances were missing from the house. Someone even took the washing machine. Linda needed money for booze, for the bars that attracted her so much. She didn't seem to see any other pleasures, although I tried from childhood to instill in her a love of beauty, books, theater, learning new things. In everything that happened to my daughter, I partly blamed her bad company, marginal teenagers from dysfunctional families. They didn't study, they didn't work. Glassy, completely empty eyes, the stamp of limitation on their faces, ungroomed, perpetually gray and ragged. And these people somehow had a great influence on her daughter. Linda was hospitalized several times. Her young body could not withstand such a life. Doctors warned that if the teenager continues in the same vein, the consequences could be fatal. So Laurel decided to take drastic measures to take her daughter to the village. Yes, sell the apartment, buy a house in a remote village, away from civilization. fresh air, physical labor, breaking old ties. And the change of scenery itself, according to the desperate mother, should have brought Linda to her senses. It was hard to get out of her own way like that, to leave everything behind and sell the apartment. And there was no guarantee that Linda would get better. But I had to try. I had to do something. Laurel sighed. Did you show her to the doctors? Of course. Once I even managed to put her in the clinic, but she ran away from there, and then refused to go to specialists at all. She was happy with everything. She didn't consider herself sick. It's not like she had to be carried around on a horse. Linda was furious when she heard her mother's decision. At first, she refused to go with her to the village, so Laurel went to her new place of residence alone. The woman was at a loss. She had only made the move for her daughter's sake, and Linda had found a way to stay in the city, living with someone from her company. It seemed that Laurel's move had backfired. She herself had pushed her daughter closer to those she had tried to keep her away from. But then Linda was back, angry, thin, wrinkled. She was quickly turning on those she so loved to spend time with. Apparently, she lived with one of her friends, but the cramped overcrowding, the lack of money, the constant yelling and fighting, such conditions did not suit her. And she had to live on something. So Linda gritted her teeth and returned to her mother. At least she would always feed and provide a clean bed. Laurel Swan was a little relieved. Maybe her plan would work after all. Maybe Linda would come to her senses here. Nothing of the sort. Soon Linda's old friends began to visit the village. Sometimes the girl herself went to the city. 150 kilometers was not such an insurmountable obstacle. Leisure activities continued. Moreover, sociable Linda, and in the village found a similar company. There was one overgrown, garbage-strewn house with a leaky roof. In it lived a woman with 5 small children from different fathers. Maybe the lady herself did not know who her children were from, as she was almost always drunk. In this house there were endless parties, in which Linda took part with pleasure. And then one day Laurel noticed that her daughter had a rounded belly. Linda, it turned out, was expecting a baby. Yes, she shrugged her sharp shoulders when her mother shared her suspicions with her. What's the big deal? I'm 18 years old. I have the right. Who's the father? Laurel asked. Was he one of our village fathers? I'm a townie, but honestly, I don't remember his name very well. We met at the club. To be honest, I can hardly even remember what he looked like. Well, it's just like you used to be. Doesn't it remind you of anything? Laurel clutched at her heart, and Linda smiled happily. She always liked to shock her mother. Even when she was pregnant, Linda was still living her usual lifestyle, drinking, smoking, disappearing to the city, and then to the village house. Her mother's request to stop drinking did not touch her. It seems that she was absolutely indifferent to the fate of her own child. None of your business. That's all Laurel heard in response to her exhortations. Laurel's grandson was born well before his due date. He was so tiny, so weak. Linda was wheeled into the birthing center right off the street since she was just in town. The contractions curled her up in front of the store. The baby was born weak and sickly and was left in the hospital. Linda was discharged alone. With her coveted freedom, she plunged headlong into her old life. Laurel Swan went to see Willie and talk to the doctors. The baby wasn't doing well. Linda's lifestyle during pregnancy had not gone unnoticed. Underdeveloped many organs and systems, heart defect, brain damage. Doctors made it clear that if the baby survived, he would remain profoundly disabled, needing care for life. But life was unlikely to be long either. Doctors unanimously advised to give up the crumb. But how? How could one abandon this touching pale baby with expressive eyes? He already recognized Laurel, looked at her, tried to smile at his grandmother. True, Linda for some time was determined to give up her son. What do I need him for? an invalid, all the more I will still give birth to another healthy. It's horrible. Laurel tried to get through to her daughter. He's a human being. What will he be like in an orphanage? And then Linda had a sudden change of heart. She said that of course she would take Willie home. As it turned out later, a friend with many children convinced the young mother. The children are entitled to benefits. There are even more for the disabled. That's all it was. Willie was discharged. The arrival of the child did not affect Linda's lifestyle. With a light heart, she was free to go home and sleep in a normal environment. Willie was on welfare, so Linda was now walking around with her own source of income. She became even more popular in certain circles. Seeing this, Laurel didn't even try to reason with her daughter. She realized it was useless. Such was the irresistible power of genes. Laurel didn't blame herself for what had happened to Linda. She knew she had given her daughter enough time and done everything she could to raise her to be a decent person. Now Laurel Swan was taking care of Willie, treating him, developing him, traveling with the baby to doctors. Of course, people, including doctors, wondered where the child's mother was, why his upbringing was being taken care of by his grandmother. Laurel lied to everyone, saying that her daughter was working so that her son would have everything he needed. And she, the grandmother, was only helping the young mother of a disabled child. No, Laurel was not ashamed of her daughter's behavior. She hadn't been afraid of people's judgment for a long time. She was afraid of something else. Linda could be deprived of parental rights, and Willie will go to boarding school. It is unlikely that he will be left to his grandmother. Neither the conditions in their house are not so good, nor the age for guardianship is already old enough, and the income is meager. So Laurel got by, giving birth to her grandson as best she could. And then Linda brought home her husband, a grown man with red, cloudy eyes from constant drinking, and announced that he would now live here. Laurel thought it couldn't get any worse and harder for her. But it turned out she was wrong. This Adrian made her existence a living hell. He immediately felt like the owner of someone else's house. Adrian emptied the refrigerator without a care in the world. He didn't care if Laurel used the last of her money to buy fruit or milk for Willie. The man never cleaned up after himself, swearing loudly at Linda and Laurel if something was out of place. Sometimes he even got handsy. And now they had a bunch of Adrian's buddies over to their house. It was unbearable. All night long, the youths were buzzing in the kitchen. Mats, loud laughter, swearing, cigarette smoke all over the house, glasses clinking. Sometimes even fights broke out. Willie was restless in his sleep. Laurel sat next to him. She couldn't sleep. There was no telling what might happen, a fire or something. No, one had to stay alert. Linda was quite happy with this existence. She defended Adrian to her mother, as if she didn't notice her husband's rough treatment of both of them. I couldn't leave. How could I leave Willie with them? Grandmother waved a jinx at the sudden return of her tears. My grandson loved me. I was his only hope, and for his sake I put up with all this. I would have run away a long time ago. In fact, that's what I did when Willie. From the very beginning, the disabled boy was expected to live a short life, but grandmother hoped for a medical error and the power of modern medicine. At first, the kid seemed to be doing well, but then the disease took its toll. Every day the boy grew weaker, thinner, became indifferent to what was happening. Nothing pleased him. His grandmother went to the hospital with him. At first they lay in the ward together. Then the child was transferred to the intensive care unit. That was it. The grandmother sobbed for several days when the doctors told her the terrible news. The daughter and her roommate were saddened only by the fact that they lost their source of income. Well, one more, the daughter shrugged. It's a simple matter, the man smirked. The grandmother, listening to this dialogue, realized no, she couldn't stay in the same house with her daughter for another minute. This is some kind of alien, scary, heartless creature. Here I packed my things and ran away here to Moscow. My pension is quite meager. My daughter took out loans in my name, and now the bailiffs are deducting them from my pension. I get pennies, but nothing. Time is passing. I'll pay it off soon. I sleep in a hostel. I don't have my own place. But it's better than enduring the antics of my daughter and her roommate. I don't always have enough to eat, so I do it at night near restaurants and cafes. You don't have the security guards like other places. That's why I come here a lot. I didn't even know you owned this place. So, life has turned around. The restaurant owner shook his head. What he had heard did not fit in his head. This kind, caring woman, a talented teacher, and lives like this. Collects food almost on the garbage dump. My heart squeezed with pity for this bright person. The teacher did not deserve such a fate. But now everything will change. To believe or not to believe, he began suddenly. But I've been looking for you. I've been looking for you for a long time, just to thank you. And now I've found you. You'll have your own apartment now. Cozy, clean, just like it used to be. If your pension isn't enough to live on, you'll work part-time as a tutor. You're a great teacher. You love your work. And people need your knowledge. I have friends whose school children need extra lessons. They will be only happy to such a tutor like you. And the pay will be good, don't even doubt it. I hate to put you to such a strain, the woman replied. Consider it a debt I'm repaying. It must have been hard for you to pay off that loan you took out to send me to the contest. And this help costs me nothing now. I'm glad. I also need you to meet my children. And you know my wife, she will be very glad to see you. The teacher smiled as she looked at her former student. Yes, I'm looking forward to seeing your and Irina's children too. I'm so happy for you. In her hurry to meet her fiancé's rich parents, Amélie stood up for the old woman. And when she crossed the threshold, Amélie flew home in tears. It was raining, she was soaking wet. The smart sundress, which the girl wore in honor of the solemn occasion, clung to her body. Her hair hung in dull strands along her face. Amélie did not even think to look for shelter. On the contrary, it was even better you could not see the tears streaming down her cheeks. You'd think they were raindrops. Oberon, how could he? Those eyes of his, the timid gaze he carefully hid from her. The man Amélie had long considered the bravest, the most reliable and loving, was almost hiding behind his silent father's back. But the mother of the family was not stingy with her expressions. No, she talked a lot that evening. The target is close at hand. The outline of a large mall, which is only a 2-minute walk from the house, is already visible in the distance. Wow. It took Amélie about half an hour to get from the center. She would have waited longer for the bus, that's for sure. That's what resentment does to people. Amélie didn't even notice she'd gone about 10 or 12 kilometers. Amélie stopped. No, you can't go home like this. Mom would be there, she'd start asking questions, worrying, and it's not good for her, even dangerous. Mom. Somewhere in Amélie's stomach an unpleasant cold ball moved. Mommy has a very bad heart. The disease progresses with age, especially lately. Mommy needs to avoid unnecessary worry. So Amélie will go to the mall now. She'll dry off a little, have a cup of coffee in the food court, sit, recover, and then put on her face one of her trademark complacent smiles, and only then will appear in front of her parents. Amélie, from childhood accustomed to take care of her mother. Many times the girl witnessed her attacks. Sometimes her mother was even taken to the hospital, and not yet an adult Amélie was left for several days or even weeks alone under the supervision of neighbors, of course, but still. Amélie and her mother had no relatives to look after the girl. They were alone in the whole world. Once Amélie learned that her mom was forbidden to give birth at all. Overheard a conversation between the parent and a friend. Then the girl, of course, asked Jane's mother questions. She at first refused, tried to change her daughter's mind. And then she confessed. "Yes, they told me," she said. "They warned me. But their predictions were wrong. They didn't believe I was carrying you at all. They predicted I'd be dead by midterm." "So how did you decide?" I thought, why should I live if I can't have you? You were already with me, living under my heart. How could I ever get rid of you? No, it's the best decision of my life. Amelie sometimes felt guilty because it was because of her that her mother was in such a state. But her mother, noticing it, even got angry with her daughter. "Don't think about such things. I wanted a child myself. How could you influence my decision? Think about it. I wanted to have a daughter like that. And I'm happy I went against all odds. And I was right, by the way. Yeah, well, my heart's racing. Where's the guarantee that it wouldn't have happened without the birth? I've had it since I was a kid anyway. Doctors used to say I'd die during pregnancy. Then they said I wouldn't survive labor. Then they assured me that my child would end up in an orphanage at the age of 2 or 3. So what do we really have?" Mother often repeated Emily that the daughter the most priceless gift that made her life. That it is a great happiness to have such a wonderful child. She also sometimes talked about Emily's father, and the girl understood that her mother loved this man very much, although she knew him only for a short time. They met by chance, ran into each other in New York on the Brooklyn Bridge. A handsome young man had come to the Big Apple for a student conference, and his mother, then still future, of course, Amelie, had gone on vacation for the first time in her life. She had recently graduated from college, got a job as a dressmaker in an attire, and began to make a good living for those times. So she saved up for a year for a trip. Young people immediately liked each other. They walked together for a long time on the picturesque streets of New York, sat in cafes. The student turned out to be so intelligent and interesting conversationalist that the young girl listened to him, holding her breath. Then they went to his room right that same evening. Both thought that this was just the beginning of the relationship, but fate had ordered otherwise. They agreed to meet at the monument at lunchtime the day after the guy finished another semester. But the girl then never waited for her lover. At first she thought that the student deceived her, but how he looked at her with admiration, gently held her hands. No, it didn't seem to be true. The eyes could not lie. And then the girl went to the hotel where the young man was staying. There it turned out that the students were urgently taken away to some military training camp, exercises or something like that. So he just couldn't come to her, couldn't get away. That's how we got lost. Amelia's mom sighed with a sad smile as she told her daughter the story. There were no social networks then, so it was impossible to find each other in the vast country. We didn't have time to exchange addresses. I searched for him. Tried to find out information about his city or university in that very hotel. They refused. It's confidential, after all. I'm sure he tried to find me too, but at least I still had you. And how could I turn down such good fortune? Amelie took a seat at a table that was hidden behind a column. She didn't want people looking at her right now. They flowed through the upper floor of the mall in an endless stream. There were couples in love among them. Young people were hugging, smiling at each other, just like she and Oberon, who had recently been happy. But of course it was not certain that this happiness would last long. Not at all. The smiling waiter brought Amelie coffee and wished her a good day. The same friendly in appearance, but in fact indifferent. He doesn't care at all what Amelie's day will be like. It's just his job. The only person in the world who cares about the girl is her mother. Her health is deteriorating. After all, until tonight the girl had hoped that Oberon would too. Oberon loves her too. He had told her that more than once, hadn't he? He was lying. Amelie sipped the hot, fragrant drink with pleasure. A blissful warmth spread throughout her body. It even felt a little lighter. A little. Maybe it wasn't so bad after all. I'd shown my true colors today. It would have been much worse if their relationship had gone further and gotten more serious. and then he'd show her his true colors. But it couldn't get any more serious than that. Amélie thought he was about to propose to her. Why else would he suddenly ask her to meet his parents? Isn't that a sign of seriousness? Amélie was a recent college graduate. She also became a dressmaker like her mother. She loved it from a very early age. She, as a very young girl, sewed outfits for her numerous dolls. She liked to think up interesting models, select materials. The process itself also gave the girl pleasure. It is a miracle there was a piece of fabric or a few pieces. And now this shapeless something turned into a wonderful dress, which makes any doll a princess. Mom worked a lot, so the girl was often left alone at home, left to herself. But she was never bored. Sewing and distracted and entertained and gave pleasure. Mom, coming from work, sincerely admired her daughter's creations. She even took these mini masterpieces Amélie in her attire and showed her colleagues. But no fashion designer from Amélie, of course, did not come out. She finished college after high school and got a profession of seamstress, and now worked in an atelier near her home. She loved her work. In her hands, everything went well. The bosses praised the young, talented employee. No one could so virtuoso as she adjust the outfit to the figure. Over time, she was entrusted with the most difficult cases, and the girl coped with them on the hurrah. She even liked difficult tasks. She saw them as a challenge. Amélie ordered herself another coffee. She needed to warm up. She didn't want to get sick and infect her mom. There was no way she could be sick. Amélie had recently done the almost impossible, arranged a consultation with a distinguished professor of cardiology. And it's completely free. Soon her mother will be examined by the best specialists in the region, and perhaps they will choose a treatment scheme that will ease the condition of a woman who is not old yet. Mom is just over 40. And yet, like a 100-year-old woman, she chokes when she walks. And her shelf in the bathroom cabinet is filled with batteries of medicine bottles. All of this made Amélie sick and very scared. Oberon somehow distracted the girl from these sad thoughts. A switch. By his mere existence, it was as if he lived in some other world. The son of wealthy parents, flitting through life like a carefree moth, meeting friends, traveling, partying. Always smiling and cheerful, he seemed to infect others with his optimism. Oberon is also, of course, handsome, tall, athletic, correct facial features, wide white-toothed smile, charming dimples on his cheeks, and eternal bronze tan on his body. Oberon often traveled with his parents. Even in winter, they flew to the ocean, where they sunbathed and splashed in the turquoise waves. Oberon also dressed stylishly and tastefully. He looked like a guy from a fashion magazine and could easily have been a model. But he had very different plans for this life. Oberon was studying at a prestigious economics university. When he and Helene first met, the guy was just finishing his penultimate year. Ahead was a difficult but interesting year's state exams, writing a diploma, graduation, and then work for his father, a well-known local businessman, owner of a network of car services. What could be in common between this bright representative of the golden youth and a poor girl, recently graduated from college and working as a seamstress? But they had a fateful meeting in a nightclub. Emily had never been fond of such places. For one thing, it was expensive. To visit this club, she spent half of her salary, which was irrational in her situation. But Susie, her childhood friend and neighbor, had asked, literally begged Amélie to keep her company. Susie had always dreamed of a beautiful life and planned at least for one evening to plunge into the atmosphere of an expensive nightclub. She had even bought a dress for the occasion. How could Amélie refuse? Amélie immediately did not like the fact that the table was occupied, and Susie immediately rushed to the dance floor. Amélie recognized her friend's silhouette among the dancing crowd and wondered, what is there to like here? The music is so loud that it seems that my eardrums are about to burst. It's stuffy, cramped, smoky. Well, since I'm here, I'll have to stay with my friend until the end. We can't leave her alone. Amélie put on her favorite tight jeans and a wide flowing top. And as it turned out, she was the one who had guessed the right outfit, not Susie in her dressy dress. Almost all the girls in the club were dressed about the same as Amelie. Not a ball at all. A couple of times she managed to get her friend out on the dance floor. "Did you come to sit here?" Susie asked, her eyes blazing with joy. And Amelie danced among the crowd of young people. Yes, it was certainly nice to relax and let the sound waves take over. At one of these moments, Oberon came up to her. He simply stood beside her and began to dance, copying and complimenting Amelie's movements. The girl, noticing this, was embarrassed, stopped, but he smiled at her in a friendly manner, took her hand and led her in the dance. Amelie spun so deftly and confidently that the two of them seemed to become one. It was an incredible sensation. During the dance, the girl looked at her unexpected beau. Handsome, incredibly handsome, stylish and dressed very expensively. Amelie had an excellent understanding of things. Because she worked in an attire, the young man was wearing clothes of expensive brands. How did such a guy even pay attention to her? Perhaps the dance would end, he would smile and leave to his equally rich friends. He probably just liked the way Amelie danced. So he paired her up for a few minutes. But Oberon didn't leave. He asked for permission to walk Amelie to her table. And since there was no one at that table, as Susie continued to conquer the dance floor, the young man offered to keep Amelie company. Wow. Amelie's heart was pounding like a jackhammer. She couldn't believe that a guy like that wanted to hang out with her. That night, they tried to talk honestly, but the loud music was getting in the way, making it almost impossible. Still, Auburn managed to shower Amelie with compliments that she had never heard from him before. "You are very beautiful in plastic. You have simply beautiful eyes." As soon as I saw them, something in me immediately turned upside down, Auberon said, looking directly at Amelie and looking very serious. The guy clearly wasn't joking or being sly. He was saying what he felt. Amelie was confused. Previously, she had only heard compliments about her undoubted talent for sewing. The girl did not consider herself beautiful. At school, the boys did not pay attention to her, noticing only the classmates with more prominent forms. What about Amelie? Skinny, tall, angular, who would look at such a thing? There were no guys at college and no guys at work. So this was the first time Amelie had ever received such delightful compliments that made her head spin. Of course, she fell in love with Auberon at once. In her mind, he was the most beautiful guy in the world, except she didn't believe anything was possible between them. Too different. Auberon asked Amelie to leave him her phone number. Amelie dictated the numbers. The young man saved her number and asked her to do the same with his. Auberon then escorted both friends in a cab home. Svetka tried to flirt with the young handsome man all the way. She, heated by drink and vivid emotions, did not immediately notice that Auberon clearly sympathized with someone other than her. The guy very delicately repelled these attacks, trying not to offend Svetka. With this, he conquered Amelie even more. What a sensitive alert. Before parting, Oberon kissed Amelie's hand. It was obvious that he wanted more to hold the girl against him, maybe even kiss her on the lips. Amelie felt it, but the boy held back and limited himself to an elegant gesture. Still, Amelie didn't believe that Oberon would call her back. The next day was a day off, and Amelie didn't have to go to work. Since the morning, she had been in suspense. On the one hand, she wanted Oberon to call. She wanted to feel the same feelings as yesterday again. On the other hand, Amelie was even a little afraid of it. What if during the day Oberon would be disappointed in her, would notice some flaw that was invisible in the light and music, would find her boring, would realize that they were not the same? See the disappointment in his eyes? That would be painful. Auberon called and said he'd pick Amelie up in an hour. He suggested a trip to the city ponds, a walk in the park, to get to know each other. He added that he couldn't think of anything else but their meeting yesterday. Amelie was very nervous about this date. She tried on all the outfits, choosing the best one, even applied light makeup, which she almost never did. Amelie wanted to hide her excitement from her mother so as not to worry her. but she noticed. Going on a date, she asked with a smile. Amelie nodded. I'm so excited for you. I hope it's a good one. Just be careful. Okay, don't worry, Mom. We're going to a crowded place, Amelie assured her parent. The fact that in this crowded place she would go in the car of an almost unknown guy the girl did not mention. Why bother her mom? She cannot explain and prove that Oberon is definitely a good man and will not do anything bad. Her mother had not communicated with him, had not seen his eyes, and I don't think it's possible to put it all into words. Amelie, of course, did not know much about cars, but when she saw Oberon's foreign car, she was stunned. She immediately realized that it was a very expensive model. A dark blue, glossy, streamlined car. The carriage as served Oberon smiled from the driver's seat. Amelie braced herself and got into the car. Despite the huge difference in wealth, Oberon behaved with Amelie simply and sincerely, joked with her, complimented her, asked her questions about her life and told her about himself. Gradually, Amelie relaxed. Oberon is so natural, so intelligent, so sweet. He's nothing like the Majors, the spoiled sons of rich parents. And stop living in stereotypes. All people are different. They took long walks in a beautiful park with fountains, fed the ducks, sat in outdoor cafes, laughed and talked. It feels like I finally met a kindred spirit, Oberon shared his impressions. You're so real. I've never met anyone like you before. What are the others like? Artificial or something? Amelie smiled. Exactly artificial, exclaimed the boy. That's a very accurate word. They see in me only a purse and a pleasant appearance. With you, it's completely different. These words made Amelie's heart warm. It made her feel good to know that she was special to Oberon, not one of many. Yes, that leaves you with nothing but sympathy, the girl joked. I guess I've been hanging around in the wrong circles, Oberon smiled, looking warmly at his companion. Their romance resembled a fairy tale. Amelie had never dreamed of such a thing. The girl loved paperback novels, but never thought that one day she would practically be the heroine of such a read. Here's the revised text. Oberon made Amelie surprises, showered her with compliments, took her to the most interesting and unusual places in the city that she didn't even know existed. He sincerely enjoyed her reactions, surprise and admiration. Are you so easy to please, so easy to surprise, he sometimes said. It's such a pleasure. I feel like a completely different person around you. I can't even express it. Oberon liked very much the sincerity of the unspoiled Amelie, and the young man often reminded her of how beautiful she was, showed photos of famous models and actresses similar to her, gave Amelie things that emphasized the advantages of her appearance. Oberon took care of Amelie. He tried to please and protect her. It was so pleasant. The girl was beginning to feel like a real princess, beautiful, fragile, and loved. She had never thought of herself that way before. Of course, her mom noticed the changes happening to her daughter and knew her boyfriends. But they didn't know each other. The woman asked her daughter questions about her chosen one. When she learned that the man was very rich, she tensed up a bit. Be careful, daughter. After all, rich people choose their life partners as equals, and with the rest they just have fun and spend time, she said. What's with the stereotypes? Mom, Amelie argued. Of course, my mom doesn't understand anything. It's not like she doesn't know Oberon, doesn't see the way he looks at me. Oberon isn't like that. And anyway, it's the 21st century, and you're still suffering from some relic of the past. I just don't want him to break your heart, the woman said, shaking her head and looking anxiously at her daughter. So what's the bottom line? Did Mom turn out to be right after all? Time goes on. Nothing changes. Could it be that at first Oberon was really enchanted by Amelie? She really wasn't like his previous girlfriends. Modest, unspoiled, hardworking. no whims, obedience and admiration. Amelie, in an effort to please Auburn, adjusting to his wishes, often agreed with his opinion, even if she herself thought otherwise. She wanted him to be happy with her. But of course there could be no future for them together. Then they were simply blinded by feelings. The girl refused to accept that fact. Amelie and Auburn were together for almost a year. The relationship between them became more and more serious. The girl could no longer live without her lover. He also wanted to spend as much time with her as possible. Only he didn't have as much time as he would have liked. Auburn was finishing his last year of university, and he often went to the sea with his parents. From warm lands, the guy invariably brought his beloved interesting jewelry, bright souvenirs, exotic outfits. The girl missed him. "Someday I'll show you all this beauty. You will look very cool in a white swimsuit against the background of ocean waves," Oberon said. "When I graduate, I'll announce to my friends that I have a fiancé." Really? That sounds a lot like a proposal deferred in time, but still, of course, a fiancé. Oberon nodded. "And what are you against it? I thought it goes without saying that we would be married soon. Now, it is true is not the time yet, but the event is just around the corner." Amelie simply put her arms around Auberon, snuggled up against him, and closed her eyes. She felt truly happy. As such, Auberon had not proposed to her. There was no ring, no discussion of a wedding. It was simply implied from that very dialogue that they would get married sooner or later. Then Auberon got his degree. His father got him a job, as had been implied from the beginning. The boy started earning decent money. He used to be sponsored by his parents, which he never hid. Now the guy was rapidly becoming financially independent, which he was very happy about. Amelie rejoiced with him and dreamed that now he will finally make her an offer. But for several months after the defense of the diploma, the proposal did not follow. But one day Auberon said that it was time for Amelie to meet his parents because their relationship is very serious. So the family is eager to communicate with the chosen one of the only heir. "Do you think it's necessary?" Amelie clarified. She was very anxious about meeting Auberon's relatives. Family had always been very important to him. The girl knew it and was afraid to disappoint her parents and her beloved. "Of course I will." "Well, what are you worried about?" "Everything will be fine," answered Auberon. Amelie, as always, immediately unconditionally believed the words of Auberon because he then still seemed strong, reliable, decisive. If her lover said that everything would be all right, then it would be so. The meeting was scheduled for Friday evening in one of the most luxurious restaurants in the city. Amelie looked at the photos of the atmosphere of this place in social networks and began to worry even more. She always felt uncomfortable in such interiors, although Auberon periodically invited her to such places. But then it was Auberon himself, and this time she would have to interact with his parents. There was no telling how they would feel about her. On the other hand, even if her mother and father didn't like her, it wouldn't affect their relationship. He is already independent and grown up. He makes his own choices, decides everything in his life. Auberon had emphasized it many times, so Amelie's happiness was not at stake in this situation, but still wanted to please the parents of her beloved, so that in their future family reigned peace, harmony, warm relations. About the upcoming meeting, Amelie preferred not to tell her mother, Helene, or she would definitely get excited, and she cannot. Recently, the health situation of Amelie's mother was getting worse. The very young woman was sick. She was often dizzy, her heart was aching. She could barely get to work, stopping at every pole to catch her breath. The doctors would throw up their hands. "What do you want?" "You have a serious defect. They told you not to give birth. You didn't listen." The disease progressed rapidly. "We are not gods and cannot work miracles," said the doctors at the hospital, where Amelie's mother went now almost every week in the hope of getting a new effective treatment. She always got the same answer. But nothing. Soon there will be a consultation with the professor, about which Amelie had agreed. This luminary of medicine will definitely help them. Amelie decided to take the trolleybus to the restaurant. She had no money left for a cab. It was still a week away from payday. The lion's share of her earnings had been spent at the beginning of the month on medicine for her mother. So what if it was a trolleybus? Amelie even liked to ride it across town and look out the window. She sometimes specially chose long routes to admire the city scenery and think about her own. But this time the girl certainly didn't manage to relax. She was constantly winding herself up with anxious thoughts. There was uneasiness in her soul. Intuition told Amelie that the meeting is unlikely to go smoothly. And as it turned out later, her instincts had not failed her. The salon was almost empty. Rush hour was long past. Amelie leaned her forehead against the cool glass and tried to calm down, but nothing worked. Maybe I shouldn't have worn this sundress. It's a nice, decent length below the knee, but the shoulders are too open. Wouldn't Oberon's parents find my outfit vulgar? Maybe I should have gone with a light business pantsuit. But I'm not going to the office, am I? Amelie's thoughts were interrupted by a squeal and a shout from the conductor. Isn't it a shame to ride public transportation as a hare at that age? The girl looked in the direction of the sound. At the far end of the cabin near the driver's seat, an ugly scene was unfolding. The conductor in an orange vest, a bearded woman with her hair highlighted with cheap dye, loomed over a dry old woman. She was huddled in her seat, clutching tightly with her hands a shabby bag full of something, and staring at the conductor in a huff. I explained to you, my dear, I'm going to my grandson's hospital, came a trembling old man's voice. I spent all my pension on a present for him. Do you understand? No. Well, what's the pity? If I drive quietly here a few stops, the cabin is still empty. And if it's full, I'll get out of this seat and stand in the corner. I won't take the seat for nothing. Whether it's empty or not is none of your business, objected the old woman. You have shown up, the conductor interrupted her. It should not concern you, but you are only supposed to pay for the ticket. Be kind and pay the required amount. If I let everyone ride for free, they would stop paying my salary. Pay up or get out. The old lady kept saying about her grandson Andrew, who was hospitalized and needs a transfer, which is carried to him by a caring grandmother. There are medicines, food, some other things. The elderly woman tried to get through to the conductor, grabbed her heart, and seemed ready to cry. But the controller remained adamant she demanded from the elderly passenger money for the fare, otherwise offered her to leave the cabin. Amelie suddenly felt very sorry for this old woman, who was so eager to see her grandson. Maybe there really is no one else to come to the person. It's not a big deal what kind of situation people are in. The toll is not that great. Of course, Amelie was far from being rich, but she would definitely have such a sum for a good deed. The old woman's eyes were so full of despair and fear. No, Amelie simply could not, like the other few passengers, indifferently watch this scene. I'll pay for this, grandmother, Amelie said, and handed the conductor some change. The conductor gave Amelie a ticket with a scornful glance at the old woman. The girl immediately handed it to her grandmother and wanted to return to her seat. But the rescued passenger grasped her hand with her dry and unexpectedly strong palm. Thank you, said the old woman fervently. Thank you for your good deeds. Don't think I'm not a beggar. I have some pension. I've worked at the factory all my life. Well, this month I'm in trouble. Grandson Andrew had an accident. I had to buy him everything. I'm taking him to the hospital, said the old lady. There's no money left at all. You give me your phone number. I'll transfer it to you when the money comes. Another surprise. It turns out that this old woman knows how to use mobile banking. A modern grandmother. No, not at all, Amelie shook her head. I won't be poor. The girl was adamant that it was a small sum for her. And the old woman, it is immediately obvious, is in a difficult financial situation. All the way to the hospital, The old woman thanked Amelie and told her about her grandson Andrew. By all accounts, he was a very decent young man. Grandma was worried about him. After the accident, he was in the hospital with injuries. But she was glad that her grandson got off relatively easy. "The wounds will heal. They won't go anywhere," said the talkative traveling companion. "The main thing is that his head is in order." Amelie nodded with a smile. And then the old woman got off at her stop, and the rest of the way the girl traveled in silence. This traveling companion distracted her a little from her anxious thoughts, relieved her excitement. But as soon as Amelie was alone, the anxiety returned. Now, sitting at a table in the cafe, drenched by the rain, Amelie mentally reprimanded herself. She should have listened to her intuition and not gone to this meeting. Now she clearly realized that nothing good could come out of it. She saw the whole situation, but a few hours ago the girl was full of hopes for a happy future together with Auburn. The luxurious atmosphere of the restaurant, of course, added to the girl's excitement. Amelie immediately saw the table where Auburn and his parents were sitting. When he noticed her, he smiled and moved towards her, embraced her, stroked her back, complimented her on her appearance. All this, of course, cheered Amelie up a little. Next to Auberon, she always had a sense of security. As it later turned out, false. Auberon's parents looked pretty much as Amelie had imagined them. Her father was an athletic, trim man with elegant gray hair on his temples, tanned, handsome. The same dimples on his cheeks as Oberon's, the same clear features. It was clear at once who the son resembled. The mother is a well-groomed woman who is, of course, a frequent visitor to beauty parlors. Smooth face with perfect skin, flawless manicure, regal posture. Her gaze. The cold stare of light blue eyes. Amelie felt as if she'd been hit by an icy shower when she looked into them. Basically, at that moment, she finally understood everything on an intuitive level, but she hadn't yet realized it with her head. The hope for a favorable outcome was still alive. "Well, hello, lovely young ladies," Auberon's father said without a smile. "Hello," the girl smiled broadly. "At last we have met you." Auberon's mother stretched her lips into the semblance of a polite smile, but her eyes remained serious and cold. Everyone introduced themselves and the waiter brought the order. At first, the conversation went on about nothing. The weather. City news. Amelie periodically inserted her lines, trying to be a full participant in the conversation. After each of her remarks, Oberon's parents looked at each other meaningfully. Amelie watched their reactions carefully. And so did Oberon. He watched his parents' faces, trying to read their emotions. At that moment, the young man looked like a small child rather than an independent, attendant adult, and Amelie didn't like that very much. Then the conversation turned to Amelie herself. "Tell us a little about yourself," asked Auberon's mother. "Our son takes you very seriously. It is not every girlfriend he introduces to us. Although, of course, this is not the first time this has happened. Auberon is a man in love. Nevertheless, I'd like to know more about you." Amelie was disgusted by the "not the first time." She was clearly being insinuated that she was neither unique nor one of a kind, but one of many, and the tone of this richly groomed woman was hostile. There was a metallic note in her voice. "Well, Amelie told me." Auberon's parents asked her clarifying questions from time to time. Who was her mother? Where was her father? What does Amelie herself do for a living? What educational institution did she graduate from? The girl's answers elicited strange reactions from these people. They looked at each other, grinned. It was unpleasant. Auberon sat next to his mother and remained silent. He did not even try to somehow diffuse the atmosphere and help his girlfriend. "Why college?" Auberon's mother asked. "You probably did not do well at school. You did not get into the university." Amelie let the barb pass her ears. The lady was obviously trying to hurt her and make her emotional. She wouldn't. Amelie did well at school, even very well. She had to get a profession, get a job. The financial situation of their small family was very precarious, but she couldn't explain it all now. The conversation was becoming more and more unpleasant. The questions and remarks of Oberon's parents became more and more personal. It was as if they were turning Emily inside out. The girl talked about herself and for some reason was ashamed of the facts of her biography, although she had never done anything bad to anyone. But Oberon's mother managed to masterfully humiliate Emily's story about herself. The girl felt herself at this table, next to these people, a beggar and a limited dullard who did not have enough intelligence for university. A poor girl who dreamed of becoming a rich heiress and thus solving her life problems. Or maybe that's what she really was. Emily, under the icy gaze of the unfriendly woman, suddenly realized that she had really counted on Oberon's help in treating her mother. Oberon didn't utter a word. He didn't even look at Emily, moving closer to his father. And so it was as if the young man hid behind his mother's shoulder. He was humiliating Emily. Oberon didn't even try to stand up for her. It was unlike him to make the girl even more confused. Oberon, he was always on her side after all, supporting her, cheering her up. But now the guy looked like a little boy who was afraid to cause disapproval of parents. And that's when Emily realized it all. No, there would be no future for her and Oberon together. His parents were now making that very clear to their son. Their aim wasn't even to humiliate Emily. They were demonstrating to their only heir that a girl seamstress, living alone with her sick mother in a tiny apartment, he is not a match. And the son had learned his lesson well. Oberon will never go against his parents' wishes. He's too dependent on them. All his success and prosperity is due to his father. Emily's feelings and her worries were completely irrelevant to these people. The girl felt like a textbook. Oberon's mother was not at all worried that such treatment could cause psychological trauma to the girl. She didn't care. The main thing was to show her son the fallacy and absurdity of his choice. Apparently, the meeting itself was conceived for that very purpose. Emily felt tears coming to her eyes. Why should I be like this? What have I done to these people? She thought. In fact, Emily had never done a single thing in her entire life that she could be ashamed of. The girl got up from her seat. I understand. I have to go, she said. I don't want to burst into tears in front of this family. No, I won't give them that pleasure. Emily hurried out of the restaurant. No one tried to stop her. The girl hoped, still hoped, that Oberon would rush after her. Oh, come on. He loves me so much, after all, as he has said more than once. But Oberon stayed with his parents. Emily burst into tears on the street. It was good that it was raining, and it was not visible to others. She didn't wait for the trolleybus, she walked. Movement always calmed her down. It was raining like a bucket. Emily's light sundress immediately soaked through and clung to her body. Pedestrians hid under awnings to wait out the downpour. Emily wandered down the road, not even noticing the discomfort. She wasn't in that state. Oberon. How could he do this to me? I had confidence in the man. Rejoiced that I was so lucky to meet my soulmate so early in life. Turns out I made it all up on myself, Emily thought. Oberon was only interested in the girl as a curiosity. He was used to meeting with spoiled princesses, and here was a modest girl who had not seen anything bright and interesting in her life. Perhaps it was pleasant for him to feel like a patron, opening the world to the poor beauty. But he had no special feelings for her. Otherwise, Oberon would not have sat there like a statue while his mother humiliated a defenseless girl in front of his eyes. And now Emily sat in the mall, sipping one cup of coffee after another. Her hair was almost completely dry and now curled beautifully. Her sundress had also become dry, and Emily had recovered enough that she could now show herself in front of her mother. She would behave as if nothing had happened. It may be dark at heart, but her mother must not notice it. Mama must be taken care of. She's the only person in the world who truly loves Emily, and probably always will be. Men, they're probably all like Oberon. They can get a nice buzz on your ears and then they're off when they've had their fun. Perhaps her father was the same. Perhaps her mother is hiding something from her. Or maybe she just doesn't realize that the boy she once fell madly in love with has run away from her. Amelie came home and went straight to the bathroom. "Did you get caught in the rain?" asked her mother, who was lying in the bedroom holding her heart. "Yes, I'm soaked through," she smiled nonchalantly. "I want to take a hot shower so I don't get sick. I'll make you some tea." "No, you lie down and rest." "I'll do it myself," Amelie replied. In the shower, Amelie cried some more. Tears this time brought relief. The bad emotions went away with them. Amelie tried very hard to behave as if nothing had happened. But her mother noticed the change in her daughter. It was impossible to hide anything from her attentive gaze. "Have you quarreled with your Oberon?" Mama asked. "How did you realize it?" Amelie was surprised. "First of all, you don't go out anymore. It's hard not to notice. And secondly, your eyes have been very sad lately." "We broke up," Amelie nodded. "He turned out to be a regular mama's boy. It's a good thing I caught it in time. He didn't hurt you." "No, not at all. I just saw that he was a mama's boy. I don't want to be around that kind of guy." "Yeah, well, I was upset, of course, disappointed. But it's okay now. That Oberon I fell in love with, he didn't even exist, you know. I just made him up. That's what I'm sad about. But I'll be smarter from now on." Amelie smiled broadly, showing her mother that she was doing well. Although, of course, the girl was still in pain. Her dreams of a happy life next to the man she loved had been shattered. Amelie still longingly remembered that former Oberon who existed in her imagination before that meeting in the restaurant. She thought she had met the perfect man, and then suddenly it turned out that such a man probably didn't exist at all. It hurt so much. Oberon's parents, especially his mother, had humiliated her, not hesitating to express themselves and not caring a bit about her feelings. If Oberon had at least tried to protect his girlfriend, to support her, Amelie wouldn't feel so devastated now. But alas. Amelie tried to live her old life, working, going out with her friends, reading a lot to distract herself. She was now constantly cleaning the apartment. The house shone with cleanliness, but the soul did not become clear and clean. And then there was that long-awaited appointment with Professor Walshian. We went to the clinic with my mother. The professor turned out to be a tall, thin old man with shrewd blue eyes. He carefully familiarized himself with the history of the heavy patient. He did not say anything, but ordered some additional tests. All the necessary procedures were carried out in the same clinic quickly, promptly, without cues. The professor himself took Amelie's mother around the rooms. The girl rejoiced, "Wow, what an attentive attitude." In the local clinic, this was not even close. As it turned out, the professor was in a hurry for a reason. He, as an experienced physician, immediately realized that the case is bad. The situation is critical. After all the examinations, the trio returned to the office. The professor was ready to pronounce his verdict. "Well, I have nothing to please you," he waved his hands. "I can't even believe that this is the result of the examination of such a young woman. The heart is worn out. It barely works. Medication won't help. We have to operate." Amelie clutched her mother's hand, who was listening attentively to the doctor's every word while remaining calm. "The operation should have been done a long time ago. I don't understand how your doctor could let the situation get so bad." The professor sounded clearly annoyed. "You can even try to sue him. But that's after. Now the main thing is the operation." And then the professor told the details of the upcoming operation. It was complicated, very complicated. Not every cardiac surgeon would do it for a patient in this condition. It is necessary treatment in New York, and this is travel, accommodation, payment of expensive medicines. And the operation itself cost a fabulous amount of money. When the professor announced the amount, Amelie shuddered. She and her mother simply have nowhere to get such a sum. except to sell the apartment and to be on the street. But even so, still real estate so quickly cannot be realized, and we need the money now. It must be done as soon as possible, said the professor, seriously looking at the confused visitors. Literally every day counts. What will happen if we don't operate? Ami's mother asked. I just can't imagine where to get such a sum of money. Is drug therapy possible? No, the doctor answered immediately. No medication will help you, only surgery. What are we going to do? Amelie whispered. She could hardly fight the tears that were coming to her eyes. All the previous worries about disappointment in Auburn suddenly seemed to her a complete nonsense. Here it was, the real trouble. And what to do about it, I don't know. Try to apply to a charitable foundation, advised the professor. They open collections for treatment. They help many people. The doctor ran his fingers over the keyboard in search of the necessary folder. He found what he was looking for and printed out a sheet with a list of charitable foundations. We'll find the money. We'll make it work, Amelie told her mother in a confident tone. Every free minute the girl now monitored vacancies. She was ready for anything to go on shift to the north, to respond to dubious advertisements offering obviously illegal activities for relatively good money. But the girl quickly realized that this was not the way out either. Until she gets a job, until she works for a couple of months to be able to apply for a loan, precious time will be lost. And she would not get into trouble herself, not to run into scammers. Most of the ads that promise golden mountains look too suspicious. And if something happens to her, how will Mom survive it? Who would help her? Amelie was desperate. She sobbed every day out of helplessness, secretly from her mother. She, on the other hand, seemed surprisingly calm. She seemed to accept her fate and did not even try to do anything, realizing that it was useless. One day Amelie took the desperate step of turning to someone who had no one else to turn to. So she dialed Oberon. Yes, they hadn't communicated all this time. Oberon hadn't called, hadn't written, hadn't even tried to apologize for his behavior at the restaurant. It seemed that he was quite satisfied with the fact that Amelie herself evaporated from his life, less problems, a mountain off his shoulders. After everything that had happened, the girl despised Oberon, considered him a mama's boy. Even his very name irritated her. She deleted all the photos of them together so that she wouldn't accidentally stumble upon them in her phone. Those pictures hurt her over and over again. She was so happy in them, so in love. And she had no idea what lay ahead of her. But anyway, only Oberon could help her. He's wealthy, he doesn't count money. Perhaps he would lend her the necessary amount, even with interest, just to get the money for her mother's operation as soon as possible. Amelie will never get such a loan, her solvency is too low, but she will try to work wherever she can, as soon as possible to pay off the debt. Amelie is not afraid of work. Here's a list of funds that really help, not scams, he said. Amelie grasped the list like a drowning man grasping at straws. On the way home, mother and daughter were silent. Each was thinking about something else. The woman was making a difficult choice for herself to fight or leave everything as it was, because the forces in this battle were too unequal. Amelie was frantically searching for a way out. She saw no other way but to fight for her mother's life to the last. When she got home, the first thing the girl did was to call every charity on the list. Amelie hoped they would help. She was sure of it, but no one wanted to help. Amelie got different answers to her appeal. Someone immediately said that they specialize only in sick children, as if adults do not get into difficult situations or less want to live. There were also inexplicable refusals without a clear explanation of the reasons. And only in one place Amelie was explained the essence. You see, the woman who answered the phone explained in a guilty voice, your situation is not too spectacular. Everyone feels sorry for little children and transfers money to them. Well, they also help fathers and mothers of the kids so that the kids don't remain orphans, especially mothers. You have a woman, your mom, an adult, working. Her daughter's all grown up. So no one's going to the orphanage, if anything. There's almost no chance that they will respond to the request. Amelie was grateful to her interlocutor for this hard, but the truth. At least now it is clear why all the foundations refuse them. It means that it is necessary to look for other ways out of the difficult situation. Relying on funds is only a waste of time. Let's put the apartment for sale, suggested the girl. Cheaper, so that sooner a buyer will be found. What are you? Sighed the woman. The operation, it is not known whether it will help or not. And you, if anything, without your corner will be left. And how will you live? No, let things go as they are. No? Amelie exclaimed. No, don't even think about it. Aliena felt the prospect of losing her mother frighten her to the point of convulsion. Sure, it wasn't easy to dial Oberon's number, but it was for her mother's sake. If it hadn't been for her illness, Amelie would certainly never have contacted her failed fiancé. Oberon answered at once. His voice sounded a little surprised, but there was no guilt or remorse in it. Oberon spoke to Amelie as if nothing had happened, as if a former classmate had suddenly called him. "Hello, how are you?" the guy asked politely. "Not so good," Amelie admitted. "I hope you're not going to start telling me about your upset feelings now. I just don't like that kind of thing. What was is what was. It's over and done with. We move on." "It's not about upset feelings," Amelie sighed. "You see, my mom, she's very sick. I told you, remember? Her heart." "I remember something like that." "So what's the next step?" "Well, the next thing is she needs surgery or she's going to die." "I'm sorry. It's sad. I hope she's going to be okay. The problem is, it's not free. It costs a lot of money. We don't have that kind of money, and there's nowhere to get it." I see Oberon grinned. "Wow. My mother is a visionary. She warned me that this would happen, didn't she, Amelie? Well, she said that once the fish was off the hook, you'd try to get your money another way. True. Mom thought it would be a heartbreaking story about your own illness or the news of your sudden pregnancy. But you brought your mother into it." Amelie was taken aback. Did Oberon really think she was just trying to screw him for money? Had he learned nothing about her during the time they'd been dating? How could Oberon say something like that? It's hurtful, painful, hard. Unfair reproaches and accusations of mercantilism hurt her soul. But Amelie pulled herself together. She can't show weakness now, she can't take offense. Oberon is her last hope. "Look, Oberon, it's all true," she began in a persuasive tone. "I can show you the certificates, the professor's conclusions, the price list of the clinic," Amelie said convincingly. "It's all easy to make up, isn't it?" The boy bent his mind. "The professor will call you himself. I'll ask him." "Hey, you're kidding me." "Yeah, that call could be made by anyone. You got a sucker." "Oberon, but it's true. I can prove it. Besides, I'm not just asking for a huge sum of money. I'll pay it back. I'll pay it all back. I'll write you an IOU. I'll pay you the interest and the debt. My main thing is to pay for the operation as soon as possible. They won't give me a loan. My official salary is too small." "Then how are you going to pay back the debt? You said yourself you can't afford the loan." "I'll work day and night, I'll work hard. But I need the money urgently right now." "That's a heartbreaking story," grinned Oberon. "It's a pity such talent is wasted. You could write novels easily, couldn't you?" "I'm sick of it," the boy said sharply. "I'm sick of listening to this nonsense. And at first I still felt guilty that everything turned out this way. You seemed to me a naive and sincere girl. And now I see that my mother was right. I accurately predicted your behavior. That's it. Don't call me again." The phone rang with short beeps. Amelie dialed Oberon's number again and again. She just couldn't convey to him the seriousness of the situation. She should explain it better. He would understand. But Oberon seemed to have blocked her number. That's all. Her last hope evaporated like dew on a hot summer's day. Amelie had no idea who else to turn to. Oberon had trampled and humiliated her again. He's made it clear that he thinks her ex is a fraud. He won't even talk to her. How could he? Tears spurted from the girl's eyes. She couldn't, and didn't want to hold them back. How often had she been crying lately? Amelie was outside, right at the bus stop. Good thing there were no other people around, but what did it matter? Amelie slumped helplessly on the bench, wrapping her arms around herself. She shuddered, her whole body shaking violently. Amelie could do nothing about the condition. It must have been hysteria. She was tired of fighting, tired of knocking on every door and getting rejected everywhere. And then there was Oberon. She had to turn to the man who had once trampled and humiliated her. And he did it again. But most importantly, Amelie was never able to help her mother. Seeing life slowly leaving a loved one day by day was unbearable. Her mother was weakening before her eyes. She didn't even go to work anymore, sitting on endless sick leave. The boss threatened to fire the woman. Who needs such an employee? And what a job. Amelie's mother could hardly move around the house, and she was still so young. And Amelie, a grown-up daughter, can't help her own mother. If it wasn't for her, Mom would be feeling much better now. Vaughn and the professor also said that pregnancy and childbirth finally undermined the woman's health. Large tears ran down the girl's cheeks, and her sobs made it hard to breathe. Amelie could not pull herself together, and then a car stopped right in front of her. It stopped and stopped. No big deal. Maybe it was just a ride to the stop. It happens. Amelie tried her best to calm down so as not to scare people. Yes, somewhere the glass opposite the driver's seat slowly rolled down. Amelie met her gaze with attentive gray eyes. It was a young man, a little older than she looked. He was looking at the girl with undisguised interest. She kept sobbing, unable to calm down. And I told you there was something wrong with her. I noticed it from afar came an elderly voice from the back seat. The man turned to the invisible passenger and nodded absent-mindedly, then turned to Amelie. "Young lady, what's wrong with you? Do you need help?" No, Amelie objected. She suddenly felt ashamed that she was sitting there crying in front of everyone. People were stopping because of her. Amelie couldn't help it. It must have been hysteria. She was tired of fighting, tired of knocking on every door and getting rejected. And then there was Oberon. She had to turn to the man who had once trampled and humiliated her. And he did it again. But most importantly, Amelie was never able to help her mother. Seeing life slowly leaving a loved one day by day was unbearable. Her mother was weakening before her eyes. She didn't even go to work anymore, sitting on endless sick leave. The boss threatened to fire the woman. Who needs such an employee? And what a job. Amelie's mother could hardly move around the house, and she was still so young. And Amelie, a grown-up daughter, can't help her own mother. If it wasn't for her, Mom would be feeling much better now. Vaughn and the professor also said that pregnancy and childbirth finally undermined the woman's health. Large tears ran down the girl's cheeks, and her sobs made it hard to breathe. Amelie could not pull herself together, and then a car stopped right in front of her. Yes, somewhere the glass opposite the driver's seat slowly slid down. Amelie met the gray, attentive eyes. It was a young man, a little older than she looked. He was looking at the girl with undisguised interest. She kept sobbing, unable to calm down. And I told you there was something wrong with her. I noticed it from afar came an elderly voice from the back seat. The man turned to the invisible passenger and nodded absent-mindedly, then turned to Amelie. "Young lady, what's wrong with you? Do you need help?" No, Amelie objected. She suddenly felt ashamed that she was sitting there crying in front of everyone. People had stopped because of her. They were going somewhere on their own. Maybe they were in a hurry, the man continued. "No, don't be embarrassed if someone has offended you or something has happened." Then the back door of the car opened and an old woman stepped out. A light pantsuit, gray hair arranged in an elegant bundle. This old woman bore little resemblance to the old lady in the handkerchief on the trolleybus who couldn't find the fare, and yet it was her. Amelie recognized her. "What a coincidence," smiled the old woman. "It's not a small town. What were the chances of them meeting again? And yet they did." "Agatha, I know you," the old woman smiled warmly. "Andrew, this is the girl from the trolleybus. Remember, I told you who paid for me when I went to your hospital." The man got out of the car too. Now both grandmother and grandson stood in front of Amelie, whose tears had dried from surprise. "Of course I remember this story." The young man smiled at his grandmother, and then looked at Amelie. "Imagine I was in a minor traffic accident. I was taken to the hospital overnight just to observe. I didn't even want to tell my grandmother. It's just that a friend of hers works there as a nurse. So I blabbed. Well, and Grandma dropped all her affairs, bought on the remnants of the pension to me food and medicine for a year ahead and rushed to the hospital," said Andrew with a slight irony. "Here you are again ironizing." The old woman looked reproachfully at her adult grandson. "But you'll understand me when you raise a child from infancy and put your soul into it. Then we'll talk about unnecessary worries and anxieties." Amelie was pleased to watch this friendly altercation. Kind, caring, sensitive people who obviously love each other very much. "And for some reason I thought on the trolleybus that your grandson was a boy or a teenager," Helene confessed. "For me, he is always small, even though he is already under 2 meters tall and has long provided for himself," smiled the old lady. "What's the trouble with you?" She turned to Amelie. "Honey, you do not be shy. Tell me. You're a kind girl. You help me then. You are not indifferent. Maybe we can do something to help you." Amelie sighed. How could these people help her? She was faced with unsolvable problems too difficult for her. And no one in the whole world could help her. Nevertheless, the girl suddenly realized that she really wanted to share her trouble with someone. Andrew and his grandmother will listen to her, that's for sure. And at least sympathize, pity. Amelie suddenly realized that all the time she had been hiding her worries from others. Even with her mother, she could not share her innermost feelings because she had a heart condition, and she should not worry. And here they are, potential listeners, sitting next to each other, asking to open their souls. And that's exactly what Amelie needs right now. "So how will you finally tell me what happened to you?" the old lady asked again. "And you do not hurry," said Amelie. "My story is not too short." "We are in no hurry," the grandmother and grandson said together. "All right," Amelie nodded her head. "But I suggest that we settle somewhere nicer," said Andrew, looking around. "There seems to be a nice pizzeria over there. How about it?" "I'm in," immediately responded the old woman. "Me too," Amelie nodded, frantically trying to figure out how much money she had left on her card. Cozy atmosphere, stylish furniture, pleasant music. The interior of the pizzeria was conducive to conversation. Andrew, despite Amelie's objections, paid for the order himself. The company settled down at a table, hidden behind racks of fresh flowers. "Now tell us about your trouble," the old woman smiled, "and we'll think together how to help you." "Good," Amelie nodded, still puzzled as to why these people would listen to her, let alone help her. So what if she paid for an old lady on the trolleybus? It's nothing, it's not worth discussing. But if they asked for it? Amelie told them everything about her life alone with her mother in a tiny apartment, about the constant feeling of guilt for the illness of the dearest person, about the fear for the life and health of her mother, which she had experienced since a very young age. The girl mentioned Auberine as well, saying that it was to meet his parents that she rode that day on the trolleybus. Details of the behavior of the mother and father of the beloved did not report, limited only to the phrase that they made it clear that she was not a match for their son, and said that after that she broke up with her fiancé. This story did not have much to do with the case, but Amelie did not hold back. The parting with Auberine still tormented her. The girl did not tell anyone about her feelings and worries, and now suddenly there were attentive listeners. She shared with them what was still weighing on her soul, her disappointment in her beloved man. Rotten people. The old woman made a verdict. Not a good thing. Nothing good in their lives. They will not choose a wife for their grown-up son on a suitable lady. There will be no agreement between them. We've been there, we know. There are many such examples before our eyes. Life will not once again punish in your willful Auberine and his parents. Andrew said nothing. He looked at Amelie with such sympathy, with such participation that words were not needed. The girl felt the man's support and approval. It was a pleasant feeling. Then it was the turn of the story about her mother again. Amelie told about the reception at the famous professor and his verdict. And now her mother needed an expensive operation, and it was urgent. I tried to find the money, Amelie continued. I did everything I could. I even went to a colleague, but he thought I was a fraud. That's why I cried at the bus stop after talking to him. What a fool, exclaimed the old woman in heart. He doesn't understand people at all. I see you for the second time in my life and I realize that you are a very honest and modest girl. Amelie continued. And he's been seeing me for so long, and he hasn't realized anything. Auberine, whom this old woman didn't even know about, annoyed her a lot. It seemed funny if it weren't for the tragic nature of the situation. Well, I can't get any money, Amelie summarized. Without an operation. Mom. The girl still could not pronounce the terrible word, but the listeners already understood everything. The old woman put her arm around Amélie's shoulders and stroked her head. Amélie cried again. But I can't help these silly tears, she continued. I can't help it. It's the first time I've been listened to. It's the first time I've been sympathized with. That's worth a lot. But the trouble hasn't gone away. And the problems haven't just evaporated. Money didn't materialize out of thin air. The old woman soothed Amélie, whispering some comforting words that really did make her feel better. Andrew silently looked at this picture and clearly thought something. How much money are we talking about? Finally asked the man. Amélie said the figures that made her panic. Andrew raised his eyebrows in surprise. What did you think, grandson? Sighed the old woman. These are the prices we have now. An ordinary person cannot get sick. And what, free of charge, this operation cannot be done? Asked Andrew. You can, replied Amélie, which has already managed to cope with emotions not without the participation of a kind old lady. For free you can wait in line for almost a year. Mom does not have that much time. Well, I am ready to give such an amount for treatment, said Andrew. Grandma looked at her grandson with pride and approval. Ellen gawked her eyes in surprise. Andrew can give her such a sum. But he doesn't look like such a rich man at all. Dressed well, but not flashy. His car is nice, but not high-end like Auberine's. And anyway, how can you accept such a gift from a complete stranger? Amélie's mind was buzzing. Well, how can she think about such details when her mom is slowly fading away without surgery? And lo and behold, still worried, anxious. Here is my edited version of the text. Amélie said cautiously. I'm afraid I can't accept such a sum. It doesn't seem right." "Everything is right and fair," assured the old lady. "You helped me in a difficult situation, and now Andrew is helping you. Boomerang, you've heard of it?" "The amounts are quite different." Amelie did not give up. "So?" The old lady didn't give up. "Who has what opportunities? Do not worry." Andrew smiled and covered Amelie's hand with his warm palm. A friendly, soothing gesture that made the girl feel lighter in her soul. "I do have such an opportunity. What's more, I spend a certain amount every year on charity. It's an ironclad rule." Amelie did not understand anything at all. If this Andrew is so rich, then why his grandmother did not have money for travel? "Andrew, I have a good boy. He is a successful businessman," proudly declared the old lady. "I raised him from a diaper. When his parents died, he was just a baby. I am not his own grandmother, even just a lonely neighbor. I couldn't bear the fact that my nice neighbor's child would end up in an orphanage. So I took him in, raised him like her own grandchild. And he was smart from a small age, serious beyond his years. I knew right away that the boy would go far. And he did." "Grandma does not miss a moment to brag about me," smiled Andrew. "But she's right. I really managed to build a business that brings a stable income. We make furniture to order. We already have many branches, and not only in our city. There's even a branch in Miami." "In Los Angeles," corrected the old lady, looking adoringly at her grandson. "Every year I spend a certain amount of money for charity. This year it should be your mom's. All the more, it seems that fate itself had arranged this meeting. What were the odds of bumping into you at the exact moment when you were sobbing with despair and helplessness at the bus stop? There's no such thing as coincidence. So can you really give us that kind of money?" Ellen still couldn't believe his happiness. "But I can't just take it," said Amelie. "Let it be a receipt. I'll pay it back slowly. I'll pay it all back." "Oh, you're so stubborn." The old woman threw up her hands. "I understand that you are embarrassed," shook his head Andrew, looking carefully at Amelie. "I know people." He does. The grandmother confirmed her grandson's words. "In business, otherwise it is impossible. Let's do it this way. I have long wanted to invest in some new enterprise. We'll register an LLC for you, an atelier that makes custom-made clothes. From what I understand from your story, you're a talented dressmaker. The amount for your mom's treatment will be part of the investment in the company. And then, when this enterprise will begin to bring income, and it will definitely happen, I'm the one who knows about such things. You will gradually and give me this money as part of the profit due to the investor. I hope I've made myself clear?" Amelie nodded. What was happening was more and more like a fairy tale. The investment, the firm, the new interesting job, and most importantly, the money for her mom's surgery. Was this really happening in reality? Amelie was suddenly afraid that now she would wake up and it would turn out that she just saw a wonderful dream. But no, everything turned out to be true. Andrew and Amelie exchanged phone numbers. And his grandmother took Amelie's number too. "Call me when you're feeling down," the old lady said. "Don't disappear. You're a very nice person. It's interesting to talk to you." And somehow it all spun up quickly. Amelie's life was changing from day to day. These changes even made her a little dizzy. First, Amelie's mom was sent to Chicago for surgery. Andrew not only paid for the necessary medical procedures, but also organized everything down to the last detail. He bought the tickets, arranged for rent for Amelie in Chicago, arranged a comfortable room for her mother, found all the rare drugs on the list. Amelie couldn't have done it on her own, especially not so fast. Andrew solved all problems as if at the snap of his fingers. He was an amazing man, Andrew. He didn't talk a lot, only business. Unlike his grandmother, he turned out to be a rather silent man. Often Andrew and Amelie would drive together on business, and both would be silent. Just silence. It wasn't oppressive, it wasn't uncomfortable. The girl felt waves of warmth and acceptance coming from Andrew. She was perfectly aware that she was falling in love with him. Of course she was, he was the perfect man. Except that the girl, every time she had such thoughts, restrained herself. Andrew. He probably has a soulmate. The man is not married. There is no wedding ring on his finger, but of course he is not free. Of course his chosen one is also ideal, some beauty of model appearance, with a pure soul and impeccable manners. Where can I get to such a one? She thought. So Amelie only had to dream from time to time that one day Andrew will pay attention to her as a girl. Only these dreams seemed to be unfulfilled. For 2 weeks, while her mother was recovering in the hospital after a serious operation, Amelie spent in Chicago. Every day she visited her parents, brought her treats, cheered up her mom. The doctor said the surgery was a success, and added that the patient had managed to jump on the last carriage of the departing train. Just a little bit more, and, in short, Andrew and his grandmother met just in time. Andrew's grandmother was always in touch. She asked Amelie about her mother's health, rejoiced together with the girl obvious improvements. She also told her what places to visit in her free time in Chicago, wherever Amelie had been during that time. She had seen everything. It was very exciting, as the girl had never been in Chicago before. Andrew also often called, but the nature of conversations with him was rather businesslike. The man was engaged in registration of a new LLC of the firm, the director and chief master of which was to become Amelie. This slightly worried the girl. Will she be able to cope? She was perfectly capable of inventing new models and sewing. This is her real vocation. It was great that she would finally have the opportunity to earn money doing something she really liked, something that inspired her. The girl had long felt that she was burying her talent in the ground, working in an attire as a simple dressmaker. Fitting things to the figure, it's quite different from sewing outfits to order. That's where the imagination runs wild. But now you have to get into the paperwork. Amelie will be the director and co-owner of the firm. She'll be fine. The main thing is that Mom was saved. Now Amelie will do everything to make the firm flourish, and Andrew did not regret his decision. She will give him the entire amount, even more. As time passed, Mom got stronger and was discharged. Mother and daughter returned home, full of plans and hopes for a new life. Mom went back to work. Now she didn't need to take sick day after sick day. She looked like a young, healthy, energetic woman again. Amelie, on the other hand, had plunged headlong into her new firm. The work was addictive, inspiring, and joyful. The girl could not be happy with what she was doing now. Andrew helped her with documents and legal issues. He did not even need to ask. He was like some kind of inner instinct, felt when and where there are problems, and solved them easily and playfully, as he always did. Amelie struggled with herself, trying not to betray her feelings for Andrew. He saved her in a difficult and seemingly hopeless situation. Of course, the role of savior and caused in Amelie romantic feelings. But did Andrew need it? Hardly. He is just a good man who could not pass by the offended Amelie, giving money at the bus stop, thought the girl, especially since he had the means to help her. And he's also a businessman who decided to try a new project in a tailor where they sew custom-made clothes. This is a potential source of good profit. That's why the man got involved. That's all. Andrew was serious, silent, even a little sullen. Looking at him, it was hard to imagine how kind and sensitive he was. With his subordinates, he spoke sometimes harshly and aloofly, especially not getting close to anyone. One day he told Amelie about his life. It happened one evening when they sat up late for a report. Andrew had lost his parents at an early age in a fire in the wooden house where they all lived together. The fire had started. A vigilant neighbor, the same old lady from the bus, called the fire department in time. They arrived quickly, but the wooden building burst into flames like a matchbox. By the time they arrived, it had burned to the ground. Andrew was lucky, then his mother put him to sleep in a stroller in the yard in the fresh air. Meanwhile, she herself was doing things in the kitchen, which was immediately cut off from the exit by fire. Father was repairing the attic and didn't get out either. The house was old. The wiring should have been replaced a long time ago, and the windows had bars left by the previous owners. Andrew's parents were trapped, but he himself was unharmed. The boy was taken in by the very neighbor who raised the alarm. She loved Andrew's parents. More than once she told the boy that they were very good and hard-working guys. Both from orphanages, both smart and focused on success. They would have achieved a lot in life, if not for the damn fire, complained sometimes guardian Andrew. You have to live for 3 and realize all the plans and hopes of your parents. And Andrew tried very hard to be the kind of man that his mother and father would be proud of. He always studied well. Study was given to him easily. There was time for walks and for extra classes. The boy early demonstrated that his hands grow from where they should. Even in childhood, Andrew himself learned to make simple furniture. And when he was only 11 years old, he and a couple of friends went to the bypass road to sell what he had made himself. The chairs and tables quickly sold out. People bought simple furniture for the garden, for the cottage. Andrew then even received the first orders. Slowly, little by little, established his business. Andrew opened his own production. By the end of school, he already had his own company with hired workers, regular suppliers, and buyers. Everything as it should be, but unofficially, because Andrew remained a minor. But the money he got quite real. Then the guy easily entered the local economic university. He specifically chose such a direction to know how to properly and officially conduct their business. Well, at one point I decided to legalize my mini firm, smiled Andrew, remembering those times. It worked. Furthermore, we grew, developed, opened branches, and now I own my own mini empire. After this story, Amelie had even more respect for Andrew. What a man. He himself rose from the bottom, went all the way from homemade furniture to a network of furniture production. That's great. Amelie's feelings for Andrew did not fade. On the contrary, they flared up day by day. Outwardly calm and even stern Andrew. No one knew how kind and considerate he really is. Lucky his girlfriend, Amelie thought. I wonder what she is like. And how does she feel about the fact that her beloved literally disappears 24 hours a day at work? That his furniture mini empire is engaged in his new project at Tyre. Amelie gradually became a keen businesswoman. Now she understood a lot of things, and almost all issues were solved by herself without the help of Andrew. The girl even realized her long-standing dream of driving. She passed the license and bought a new car in the salon. Not expensive foreign car, but quite a good and reliable car. Amelie was a very careful driver, but unfortunately not everything depends on a single road user. Racers and daredevils are not cancelled. There are plenty of them everywhere. One day Amelie was caught up with such a rule breaker. It happened right at an intersection. The airbag didn't deploy for some reason. Amelie hit her head on the steering wheel, no harm done, but she cut her forehead. An ambulance arrived at the scene and took her to the city hospital. She needed a few stitches. Amelie sat in the treatment room while the doctor worked on her forehead. The girl did not feel any pain. All she could think about was how badly her favorite car had been damaged. When the wrecker was taking the car away, Amelie didn't have time to see the damage, but it was obviously more serious than her own small injury. After the doctor finished his work, the girl was lifted into the room. Can I go now? I just have a lot to do at work today. I feel fine, she turned to the doctor. No, the doctor shook his head. You'll have to spend 24 hours in the hospital. We have to rule out a concussion. Amelie was frankly bored in her single room. She didn't intend to go to the hospital, so she hadn't even brought a book. At least she could read now. And so there was only the phone. The girl told her mom that she was spending the night at a friend's house. She didn't tell her about the accident. Amelie was used to protect her mother from stress, although her mother's health now did not cause any concern. Amelie lay on the bed, leafing through the news feed, when the door of the room rattled open. Standing on the threshold was Andrew, his hair disheveled, anxiety in his eyes. Seeing Amelie staring at him in surprise from the bed, he jumped up to her and hugged her tightly. "I was so afraid of losing you." Warmth went through the girl's body from these sincere words of Andrew. He cared about her. Wow. Amelie pressed herself against him with pleasure. She had been dreaming about this for so long. "I was afraid that there was something serious with you." Andrew pulled back a little and looked into the girl's eyes. "Video in the local Publix, your mangled car. Got the license plate. It says the driver was taken to the hospital in serious condition. I don't think I could not without you." "I'm fine," Amelie smiled. It was exaggerated on purpose to make it more interesting for people to read. "It's just a scratch on my forehead. The doctor put in a couple of stitches. That's nothing." Andrew smiled back. "Well, now it seems there's no point in hiding it," he said. "I didn't tell you anything, because you were, well, kind of dependent on me. I didn't want to embarrass you," Andrew admitted. "I myself do not know at what point I have feelings for you. Maybe when you told us about your trouble at the pizzeria, or maybe when we organized your mother's treatment together with Auburn. I don't know, but I've never met anyone so sincere, honest, and beautiful. Today, when I heard about the accident, I was so afraid I'd lost you forever. It's such a fear. I've never experienced that before." Amelie smiled. She will find the words to tell Andrew how she feels, but a little later. Surely he himself can see everything in her eyes. Andrew is smart, and he has a keen sense of people. "Well, now you are in the same situation as your grandmother once," Amelie smiled. "Remember, she said at the bus stop that someday you would understand her, that you would realize how scared you were for your loved ones. And that's what happened." And it's true, and Andrew's eyes lit up a cheerful light. The situation is very similar. Grandma, as always, was right, and so in everything.